The ring hit the marble floor before anyone in that boardroom had time to breathe. Derek Halston didn't throw it. He placed it deliberately, with 2 fingers, like he was discarding a receipt. Then he straightened his cufflinks and said, loud enough for every attorney, every investor, every executive in the room to hear, "You were never the kind of woman a man like me brings home." Zuri Bennett didn't cry. She wanted to. But she had learned in 33 years of being too much for some people and not enough for others to hold the earthquake inside her chest until she could get somewhere private. She never got that chance because the man at the head of the table put down his pen, and everything changed. If you've ever been dismissed in a room full of people who said nothing, if you've ever had someone reduce you to a body instead of a mind, stay with this story. Subscribe to this channel, hit the like button, and drop a comment telling me the city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. And don't go anywhere, because what happens next in that boardroom will stay with you longer than you expect. The morning of the merger had started the way all of Zuri's mornings started, earlier than everyone else's. She had been at her desk on the 44th floor of the Hedong Meridian building at 548A. A cup of coffee, going cold, beside her keyboard, while she worked through the 3rd read of a contract. Most of the legal team hadn't finished their first. The cleaning staff knew her name. The overnight security guard, a retired transit cop named Gerald, had started leaving a spare granola bar in her top drawer sometime around her 3rd year. She never asked him to. He never mentioned it. That was the kind of relationship Zuri had built at Hedong Meridian, quiet, functional, built on showing up when nobody was watching. She had found the first error at 6:14 a.m. It was buried in a subordinate clause on page 89 of a merger document that represented the largest acquisition in the company's 40-year history. A single number in a liability cap that would have, if uncorrected, exposed Hedong Meridian to a renegotiation trigger worth approximately $340 million. She flagged it, documented it, and sent a memo to the legal team's senior partner before 7 o'clock. By 9, the senior partner had forwarded her memo to the chairman's office, with his own name on it. Zuri noticed. She always noticed. She had learned not to say anything about it. That was the particular tax levied on women who worked in rooms where their contributions made other people look good. You paid it or you left. Zuri had been paying it for 5 years. She found 16 more errors before noon. The merger meeting convened at 2 o'clock in the executive boardroom on the 47th floor. Floor-to-ceiling glass on 2 sides, a conference table that seated 24, and a view of lower Manhattan that looked like someone had engineered it, specifically to remind you that the rest of the world was very small. International attorneys, senior executives from 3 countries, investors who had flown in from Seoul and Singapore specifically for this signing. The kind of room where everyone in it had an hourly rate that exceeded most people's weekly salary. Zuri sat at the far end of the table, 1 chair removed from the primary seating arrangement. That was where she always sat, close enough to be useful, far enough to be forgettable. Derek was positioned near the center. He had insisted on it. He always insisted on positioning. Derek Halston was 37 years old, worked in acquisition finance at a firm 2 buildings away, a sound like Green, and had spent the better part of their 14-month relationship treating Zuri like a combination of personal assistant, emotional support system, and occasional ornament, the last function contingent on whether she wore something he had pre-approved. He was handsome in the way that certain men are handsome, constructed rather than natural, held together by expensive grooming and the specific confidence that comes from never having been told no by anyone who mattered to him. He had proposed 8 months ago in a restaurant he had chosen because it photographed well. Zuri had said yes because she had spent long enough telling herself that what she had was close enough to what she wanted. She understood now, sitting in that boardroom, that she had been lying to herself. She had been lying for a long time. The meeting ran for nearly 90 minutes without incident. Documents moved down the table. Attorneys conferred in quiet clusters. Zuri answered 4 separate questions from 3 different executives, each of whom addressed their follow-up to someone else. The head of the table, Kang Ji-hoon said almost nothing. He had that quality, the kind of stillness that isn't passivity, but something closer to the patience of a man who already knows how a situation will end. 41 years old, immaculate in a charcoal suit that had not been purchased at a department store. The chairman of Haedong Meridian Group, a Korean-American shipping empire that moved freight across 6 continents. He had held the chairmanship for 9 years. Before that, the record was deliberately obscured. Zuri had learned not to ask about the before. She had worked for him for 5 years and could count on one hand the number of times he had raised his voice. He was signing the final document when Derek spoke. It wasn't an outburst. That was the thing that made it worse. An outburst could be attributed to stress, to the compressed tension of a high-stakes negotiation, to a man losing his grip. What Derek did was measured, deliberate. He waited for a pause in the room, a natural break in the ambient noise, and then he spoke clearly, as if he were making a point in a presentation. "I've been thinking," Derek said, "and I'm done." Zuri looked up from her notes. "Done," she said. With this, he gestured at the space between them with his chin. "With us. With whatever this was." The room shifted. Not loudly. A few attorneys looked at their documents. One of the sole executives looked at his phone. The adjustment was barely perceptible, but Zuri felt it the way you feel a temperature drop suddenly aware of your skin. "Derek, you know what your problem is," he said it conversationally. Almost gently. "You've convinced yourself that working hard is the same as being enough. It's not." He pulled the engagement ring from his jacket pocket. He had been carrying it. He had brought it here, to this room, on this day, because he had planned this. "You're smart, Zuri. I'll give you that. But smart doesn't fix everything. And there are women who look the part. Women who," he paused, let the room absorb the pause, "who a man in my position can actually be proud to stand next to." He set the ring on the table in front of her. Zuri did not move. "You're not wife material," he said. "You never were. I just took too long to admit it." She stood up from her chair not to confront him, but because her body made the decision before her mind did, and her elbow caught the edge of her folder. 240 pages of merger documentation cascaded off the table and across the marble floor in a wide arc, white pages splaying like something broken. She went down with them, one knee hitting the floor as she reached to stop the fall that had already happened. Her palm caught the edge of a page and sliced a paper cut across 3 fingers that she didn't feel until much later. Nobody moved. 14 people in that room, not counting the man who had just publicly dismantled her engagement, and not one of them moved. Zuri was on one knee on the marble floor, surrounded by the work she had done until 3:21 that morning, and the room was perfectly, horribly quiet. Then a chair moved. Not Derek's. He was still standing where he had been, one hand in his jacket pocket, waiting for some acknowledgement of what he'd done that he would never name as waiting. Kang Ji-hoon stood up from the head of the table, walked the length of the boardroom without hurrying, and knelt beside her on the marble floor. He gathered pages. That was all he did. He collected them methodically, straightened the edges, held out his hand for the one she was still holding. He didn't say anything to her immediately. He just worked, the way a man works when he has decided something and is done deliberating. When the pages were collected, he stood and placed them on the table in front of her empty chair. Then he looked at Derek. "I want to make sure I understand what just happened." His voice was very quiet. It was always very quiet when it mattered. Ms. Bennett identified 17 contractual errors that our legal team missed. She worked until 3:21 this morning to protect this merger. And you used this room on this day with these witnesses to tell her she doesn't look like the right kind of woman. Derek said nothing. "Say it again," Ji-hoon said. Derek's jaw tightened. "I said what I said." Ji-hoon turned his head toward the door, where his security chief, Seo Min-jae, had appeared without being summoned. 40 years old. A man whose ability to move silently through any space had long since stopped being remarkable to anyone who worked in that building. "Erase his access," Ji-hoon said. Min-jae left. He was gone for 11 minutes. In those 11 minutes, Derek's security badge stopped working. His firm received a call from a senior partner at the legal group handling 3 of their largest client accounts. 2 of his personal financial accounts were flagged by fraud investigation divisions due to filings that had been sitting in a queue for some time and were now, for reasons of internal compliance, being expedited. The concierge at his building called to inform him that his resident key fob had been deactivated pending a lease renewal review. His corporate credentials were suspended pending an internal HR inquiry that had been initiated by 2 colleagues who had, until this morning, declined to put anything in writing. Derek Halston did not know any of this while he was still standing in the boardroom. He found out in pieces over the following 3 hours, each piece arriving like a separate verdict. Zuri learned about it later. At that moment, she was focused on breathing, on keeping her face arranged in an expression that didn't give Derek Halston the satisfaction of seizing how precisely he had placed the blade. She had known something was wrong for weeks. The way he'd grown quieter around her friends, more pointed in his corrections when they were alone, more absent in the ways that weren't about travel or work. She had talked herself out of it the way people talk themselves out of things they're not ready to name. Now it was named, publicly, in a room with international witnesses and a marble floor cold enough that she could feel it through her knee. The signing continued. Jihoon returned to his seat and finished the document. Attorneys resumed their quiet conferring. The executives from Seoul said nothing about what had happened, which was itself a form of acknowledgement. Derek left before the meeting concluded. He didn't look at Zuri when he went. She stayed until the last document was signed and the last attorney had packed their case. She answered 2 more questions. She restacked the pages she had collected from the floor and left them in the correct order in the correct folder on the corner of the table. Gerald was at the security desk when she came through the lobby. He looked at her face and said nothing, which was the right thing to do. She made it to the parking garage before her legs stopped cooperating. She sat on a concrete parking block between 2 SUVs and put her head in her hands and allowed herself 4 minutes of something that wasn't quite crying but was in the same territory. Her shoulders shook. The paper cut on her fingers had dried into a dark line. Stop. Then she stopped, because Zuri Bennett had never had the luxury of falling apart for long, and the muscle memory of pulling yourself together is the kind of thing that doesn't wait for permission. She drove home. She changed out of the suit. She made tea that she didn't drink. At 9:47 p.m., her phone produced a sound she didn't recognize, not a call, not a standard notification, but a tone she hadn't set. Attached to it was a set of coordinates and a single line of text. Come alone. Come now, what you see stays with you. There was no sender ID, but at the bottom of the screen, so small she almost missed it, was the Hedong Meridian Internal Employee Identification Number. Jihoon's. She went. The address was a warehouse in Red Hook, Brooklyn, near the water. From the south side, it was indistinguishable from the 30 other industrial structures on that block. Corrugated metal, a freight door, no signage, a parking area with trucks that had been moved to suggest ordinary commerce. The freight door opened before she reached it. Min Jai was waiting. He said nothing. He led her through a corridor she would not have found without guidance, down a staircase that existed behind a wall panel she would never have identified as a wall panel, and into a space that stopped her mid-step. The underground room was enormous, larger than seemed possible given the building above it. A digital wall, the full length of the far side, tracked cargo ships in real time. Freight corridors lit across continental maps. Financial transfer volumes cycled through rolling columns of numbers. Port authority data refreshed in 20-second intervals. Fuel supply chains blinked green and amber across shipping lanes she recognized, and several she didn't. Men and women moved through the space at workstations arranged in precise rows. Nobody looked up when she entered. Jihoon was standing at the center of it, his jacket gone, his sleeves rolled back, looking at a particular cluster of shipping routes near the eastern seaboard. "You should sit down," he said without turning around. "I'm fine standing," Zuri said. He turned then and looked at her the way he occasionally looked at a problem that had just revealed its actual shape. Someone has been stealing information from this organization, he said. For 7 months, she waited. Derek was involved, he said. But I let him go this afternoon. The room continued its work around her. Nobody paused. Nobody looked. You let him go, she said. He's going to lead us somewhere more important. Ji-hoon returned his attention to the wall. The man who gave him his instructions is named Victor Sloan. Sloan has been trying to dismantle what I've built for 11 years. Derek is terrified, financially ruined, and socially finished. Terrified, ruined men make contact with whoever promised them a way out. Zuri looked at the wall, at the ships, at the numbers. How long have you been building this? She asked. Longer than you've been working for me. She thought about the merger document, about 17 errors, about the memo that had arrived in the chairman's office with someone else's name attached to her work. About 5 years of arriving before anyone else and leaving after everyone else, and building something that nobody had ever, in this room or any other room, described as extraordinary. Why did you show me this? She asked. Ji-hoon was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of a man choosing his words. The silence of a man who had already chosen them and was deciding whether the timing was right. Because tonight, he said, someone is going to try to use your name to move a ship. The alert came at 2:17 a.m., a pharmaceutical vessel registered to a Haedong Meridian subsidiary. $600 million in declared cargo. Destination change authorized 48 minutes ago. The authorization signature belonged to Zuri Bennett, Senior Operations Associate. Employee identification confirmed. Timestamp verified. System access log clean. Every head in the room turned toward her. Every head except one. Prove it wasn't you, Ji-hoon said. He said it without accusation. As a statement of what needed to happen next. Zuri sat down at the nearest open terminal. Her hands were steady in the way that hands are steady when fear gets overridden by something more useful. The authentication log was clean because whoever had copied her credentials was competent. But competent wasn't the same as thorough. Zuri had designed the access renewal sequence herself 18 months ago during a security overhaul that she had volunteered for because nobody else had the time. The sequence had a 37-second biometric overlap window, a peculiarity of the system architecture that she had documented in a file no one had asked to read. If you entered her credentials without passing through that window at the correct interval, the system logged you as authenticated but recorded the gap. The gap was there. 19 seconds short. Whoever had built the counterfeit authorization had not known about the 37-second window because it lived in a doc that had never been shared with anyone outside the security overhaul team. She pulled the gap timestamp. She cross-referenced the server log. She found the originating IP routed through 3 anonymizing layers, which was sophisticated, but the routing itself created a pattern that matched 2 prior unauthorized access attempts she had flagged 4 months ago and which had been dismissed as system anomalies. Turned the screen toward the room. Ji-hoon looked at it for a long moment. Then he simply nodded, forward the log to Minjae. He did not say he had believed her the entire time. He didn't need to. It was in the nod in the absence of any moment in which he had treated her as a suspect rather than a colleague. Zuri forwarded the log. It was 3:44 a.m. by the time the pharmaceutical vessel's destination change was reversed through legitimate Port Authority channels, and the ship returned to its original course. She thought, sitting in that underground room while the digital wall continued its quiet work around her, about Derek standing in the boardroom with 2 fingers holding her ring, waiting for her to perform the collapse he had scripted. She had not given him the collapse. She had given Ji-hoon something else entirely, and she was only beginning to understand what he had seen in it. Outside the harbor was dark. Ships moved through it with the indifferent patience of things that did not know they were carrying the weight of someone else's war. And in a warehouse in Red Hook that did not appear on any public directory, a plus-size black woman, who had been told was not enough, sat at a terminal and rebuilt what someone had tried to steal from her, while the most dangerous man in 3 boroughs watched her work and said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. The pharmaceutical vessel's course correction was confirmed at 3:51 a.m., and the room exhaled in the collective, barely audible way that rooms exhale when a crisis has been walked back from its edge without anyone having to admit how close it actually got. Zuri stayed at the terminal for another 20 minutes, after there was nothing left to do at it. Her eyes moved across the screen, but she wasn't reading anymore. She was doing what she always did after an adrenaline crash, waiting for her hands to feel like her own again. Minjai brought her coffee without being asked. Black, no sugar, which was correct. She didn't ask how he knew. "You should sleep," he said. "Probably," she said, and didn't move. Jihoon had retreated to the far end of the room, where a separate cluster of monitors tracked something she hadn't been cleared to look at yet. She could see his reflection in the dark glass above the workstation, still precise. A man turning a problem in his hands, the way a jeweler turns a stone. He's deciding whether to cut. She thought about the gap in the authentication log. 19 seconds. Whoever had built that counterfeit authorization had been sophisticated enough to replicate her credentials across 3 security layers, but had not known about a window she had designed in a document that lived in a folder that had never been shared. That wasn't a random failure. That was a specific gap in specific knowledge, which meant whoever had done it had access to most of what she knew, but not all of it. She typed that thought into a blank document and stared at it. Most, but not all. Someone had been inside the system long enough to learn the shape of her access, but not the contents of every file she had ever touched. That was either a time constraint or a permission ceiling. Either they had gotten in recently, or they had gotten in with someone else's credentials, someone whose access level was close to hers, but not identical. She cross-referenced the 4 other senior operations staff members, pulled access logs for the past 7 months, started building a comparison grid. Minjay was watching her from across the room. Not surveillance more, the way a man watches someone do something he didn't expect and is recalculating. At 4:23 a.m., Jihoon appeared behind her left shoulder. She hadn't heard him move. "Go home," he said. "I'm close to something. You're exhausted and you're going to make an error." He said it without criticism. It was just a fact he was reporting. "Whatever you're building, save it and go. Minjai will have someone drive you. I drove myself. Then Minjai will have someone follow you to make sure you get there." She turned to look at him. He was serious. He was also right about the exhaustion. She could feel the particular blurring at the edges of her thinking. That meant her pattern recognition was beginning to generate false positives. She saved the file. She noted the timestamp. She closed the terminal. Jihoon said nothing else. He was already back at his own monitor before she reached the staircase. She got 3 hours of sleep that she would later describe as the worst and most necessary 3 hours of her recent life. When she woke, the paper cut on her fingers had closed into a thin red line, and the light through her apartment windows had the pale, unconvincing quality of a morning that had not decided yet what it wanted to be. She was back at Haedong Meridian by 8:15. She did not go to Black Harbor. She went to her regular desk, on the regular floor, opened her regular workstation, and behaved with the ordinary precision of a woman who had a normal night and a normal morning. Because somewhere in the building, or somewhere with access to the building systems, was the person who had not known about the 37-second window. And that person, if they were watching, and she had to assume they were watching, needed to believe she had noticed nothing. The merger documents from the previous day had been formally filed. The legal team's senior partner stopped by her desk at 9:30 to collect a signature she hadn't been told she needed to provide. He avoided her eyes the entire time. She signed, said thank you, and watched him leave without letting anything show on her face. 10:44, Derek called. She let it go to voicemail. Then she blocked the number, because whatever Derek needed to say was either an apology she didn't want or an explanation she didn't require. She had stopped needing Derek Halston's explanations sometime around 3:44 in the morning, though she couldn't have told you the exact moment it finished. The voicemail notification sat on her screen for 11 seconds before she deleted it without listening. At 11:20, she received a calendar invitation for a meeting she hadn't been included in before. Internal security review restricted attendees. Conference room B20 p.m. Her name was on the list. Third from the bottom, below two names she recognized and one she didn't. The name she didn't recognize was Thomas Carey. She looked up Thomas Carey in the company directory. Senior Logistics Coordinator, 4 years with the company. Based out of the Operations Division, which shared a floor with her department but was on the opposite side of the building. She had seen his name on freight routing approvals but had never spoken to him directly. Pulled his access log. She was authorized to do so. Her security clearance covered the Operations Division. It was one of the permissions that would have been close to, but not identical to, what an outside actor might replicate from her credential profile. Thomas Carey had accessed the pharmaceutical vessel's routing file 6 times in the past 3 weeks. Standard for someone in logistics, except that the vessel wasn't in his assigned routing cluster. His cluster covered the Mid-Atlantic rail connections. The pharmaceutical vessel was Deepwater International. He had no operational reason to be in that file. She closed the log and sat with the information for a moment. Then she picked up her phone and texted Minjai a single line, Thomas Carey. Logistics. Check his financial history from the past 8 months. Minjai replied, in 40 seconds, already flagged. Don't approach him. She hadn't planned to. The 20 p.m. meeting was held in a conference room that was noticeably less impressive than the 47th floor boardroom, the kind of room that exists in every large organization as a space for conversations that need to happen but shouldn't be visible from the outside. Round table, 8 chairs, no windows. Ji-hoon was already seated when she arrived. Min-jae stood near the door. The 2 names she had recognized from the invitation were Richard Pace, Haedong Meridian's head of internal compliance, and Dana Ko, the company's chief information security officer. Both of them looked like people who had also not slept particularly well. Thomas Carey was not in the room. He was, Min-jae explained without preamble once the door closed, currently being interviewed in a separate location by 2 members of the security team. He had been flagged 3 days ago as a potential internal leak. The pharmaceutical vessel incident had accelerated the timeline. He didn't act alone, Dana said. She pulled up a laptop and turned it toward the table. The screen showed a network map, not unlike the digital wall in Black Harbor, but smaller and focused specifically on the internal communications infrastructure of Haedong Meridian's Operations Division. Whoever orchestrated the credential copy had inside help. Carey provided routing access, but the credential architecture itself, the work required to replicate Ms. Bennett's authentication profile to that level of detail that required someone with a much higher clearance level. Everyone looked at the network map. Zuri looked at the map and thought about the gap. 19 seconds, the 37-second window, the document that had never been shared. The gap in my authentication sequence, she said. Can you trace which files they accessed versus which they didn't? Dana typed for a moment. The map shifted. A cluster of files lit up in yellow files that had been accessed as part of the credential replication. And at the edge of the cluster, a single file in gray. Unaccessed. The security overhaul document. They pulled everything associated with my standard credential profile, Zuri said. But they missed the overhaul file because it's not attached to my standard profile. It lives in a legacy folder from the infrastructure project. Which means, Ji-hoon said quietly, they had high clearance, but they didn't know your history here. Someone who joined after the overhaul, Richard Pace said, or someone who was given a credential package rather than building their own familiarity with the system over time, Dana said. The distinction mattered. Someone given a credential package was working from a briefing, not from organic knowledge. They had been told what Zuri's access looked like, but hadn't spent time actually navigating it. That was a handler and asset structure. Someone inside Haedong Meridian was being directed by someone outside. Victor Sloan, Zuri said. Nobody contradicted her. Ji-hoon's expression didn't change, but something in his posture settled the micro-adjustment of a man whose working theory has just received confirmation from an independent direction. Carey's interview, Min-jae said from near the door. He's talking. How much? Ji-hoon asked. Enough to confirm the external direction. Not enough to give us Sloane's current operational structure. Richard Pace leaned back in his chair and let out a slow breath. We have a compliance problem, he said. He meant the leak more broadly, not just Carey, but whatever the leak had compromised and what it meant for the merger filing that had been completed that morning. The filing goes to the regulatory authority in 72 hours. If Sloane has people inside that authority, he does, Ji-hoon said. The room went quiet, the way rooms go quiet when someone names the thing everyone was hoping wouldn't be named. Then, we're not just managing an internal breach, Richard said. We're managing a regulatory intercept. They're going to try to use the filing to create grounds for a delay. And a delay gives Sloane time to finish what he started, Zuri said. Richard looked at her. He looked at her the way people had been looking at her all day, with the particular recalibration of men who had filed her in the assistant category, and were now encountering her in a different one without. Having received a formal notification of the change. She didn't address the look. She turned back to the network map on the laptop. The regulatory intercept only works if they have the filing, she said. What if they don't? Dana frowned. It's a mandatory submission. It is. But the submission protocol allows for a 72-hour technical hold if the filing entity identifies a potential documentation discrepancy requiring internal review. Zuri looked at Ji-hoon. I found 17 errors in that merger document. We'd submitted the corrected version, but if I file an internal review notice citing a potential 18th discrepancy requiring verification, that triggers the hold without raising external flags. The room was quiet again, but a different kind of quiet. Is there an 18th discrepancy? Richard asked carefully. There might be, Zuri said. I'd need to look more carefully at pages 112 through 118. The subsidiary liability cross-reference in that section is it's probably fine. But probably is worth 72 hours if the alternative is handing Sloane a regulatory lever. Ji-hoon looked at her for a long moment. File the review notice, he said. Richard started to say something about process. Ji-hoon's attention moved to him with the specific quiet weight of attention that did not need to be accompanied by any other signal. Richard did not finish his sentence. Dana closed the laptop and stood. Min-jae opened the door. The meeting was over. Zuri filed the internal review notice at 4:17 p. It was a 4-paragraph document, procedurally flawless, citing Section 7.3 of the submission protocol and referencing a page range in the subsidiary liability clauses. It would hold the filing for exactly 72 hours. So it was completely defensible and entirely accurate because she had actually gone back to pages 112 through 118 and found what she now genuinely believed was a minor cross-reference ambiguity that warranted clarification. Whether it actually warranted a 72-hour hold was a matter of professional judgment. Her professional judgment said yes. She sent it and sat back and waited to feel something about what she had just done. She had used a legitimate procedural tool to create a protective delay for an organization she was beginning to understand was not entirely what she had spent 5 years believing it to be. She thought about Black Harbor, the digital wall, the shipping routes she couldn't name. The fact that Ji-hoon had knelt beside her on the boardroom floor to gather scattered pages, and that she had not yet fully worked out what that meant, and that working it out required more data than she currently had. She thought about Derek. She thought about him, deliberately, the way you press on a bruise to test whether it's healing not for pain but for information. It hurt less than it had at 9:47, the previous evening, when she had been sitting in her kitchen with undrunk tea and the specific silence of an apartment that used to feel temporary and was now beginning to feel permanent. It hurt, but it hurt the way a wound hurts when it's already closed a tightness rather than an opening. She deleted the blocked contact notification. She didn't unblock the number. She just deleted the record of having blocked it, which felt like the more complete gesture. At 6:00 p.m., the floor cleared. At 6:45, Min-jae appeared at the entrance to her office. Carey gave us a name, he said. A second internal contact. Someone we didn't have flagged. She looked up. Who? He said the name. She knew the name. She knew the name well enough that hearing it produced a specific physical response, a drop in her stomach, fast and cold. Not because she had suspected this person, because she hadn't. Because she had sat across from this person in project meetings and consulted with them on access protocols and shared at one point a takeout order on a late night during the security overhaul. When was all she said. Carrie says the contact was established 6 months ago, before you designed the renewal sequence. But after the overhaul document was filed. Yes, which meant this person had known the overhaul document existed, had known it was filed in a legacy folder, had not accessed it, had not told Sloan's people about it. Whether that was oversight, loyalty, or something else entirely was a question she would need to sit with. Where are they now, she asked. Building, 9th floor. They don't know, Carrie talked. Zuri picked up her phone. She did not call Ji-hoon. She called the extension for after-hours facilities. Coordination as number she knew because she had called it on 17 separate occasions when she was working late and needed something adjusted. The woman who answered knew her voice. I need the 9th floor server room locked down for a routine security sweep, Zuri said. Starting in 15 minutes. Standard protocol. No announcement. I'll need a compliance authorization. Zuri gave her Richard Pace's compliance code, which she knew because Richard Pace had given it to her 8 months ago during a system access review and had not changed it since, because people with authority rarely change the things they've delegated. The server room locked down in 12 minutes. 2 minutes after that, the second internal contact attempted to access a data terminal on the 9th floor and found themselves in a corridor with a locked room and a keycard that no longer worked. Minjai got the notification on his phone. He looked at Zuri. You locked down the server room, he said. Routine and security sweep, she said. He studied her face, the way you study a document that contains information you weren't expecting. Then he typed something on his phone and turned away. She did not ask what he typed or to whom. Ji-hoon arrived on the 9th floor 7 minutes later. He was not alone. 2 members of the security team she had seen in Black Harbor flanked him on each side, though they moved with the deliberate invisibility of people trained not to draw attention to their function. The second internal contact was a 31-year-old systems analyst named Kevin Park. He had been with the company for 2 years and 8 months. He had a younger sister in medical school and a mother in assisted living in New Jersey and a gambling debt that had been accumulating for approximately 11 months, 6 months, before Sloan's people had made contact. 1 month before the amount had reached a number that a systems analyst salary could not address in any realistic time frame. Zuri learned these details later. At the moment she was standing in the corridor, watching Ji-hoon look at Kevin Park, she knew only the name and the betrayal. Kevin Park looked at Ji-hoon and went the specific gray color of a man who has just understood that the gap between what he planned and what is happening cannot be crossed. I have a family, Kevin said. So do the people on those ships, Ji-hoon said. It wasn't a threat, it was a correction. Kevin flinched from it the way you flinch from cold water rather than a blow. The conversation that followed was not loud. Ji-hoon conducted it the way he conducted most things that mattered, with a stillness that forced the other person to fill the silence. Kevin talked for 26 minutes. He talked about the gambling debt and the contact and the instructions he had been given and the information he had passed. He talked about Carrie, whom he had known was involved, but had not recruited himself. He talked about a third point of contact, someone outside the building, someone he had never met face-to-face, but communicated with through a routing service that he had believed was untraceable. Was not untraceable. Dana Coe, informed by text during Kevin's confession, had the routing address broken into component IPs within 38 minutes of receiving the information. Terminated at a server cluster registered to a logistics consulting firm in Hoboken, New Jersey. The firm had no public-facing website. It had 3 registered employees, none of whom appeared in any professional directory. One of the corporate registration documents listed a director. The director's name was a shell, but the registered agent was a law firm that Minjai recognized because he had encountered it before in a different context, 2 years earlier, during an investigation that had ultimately been suspended when the target moved his operation across state lines. The law firm represented 3 of Victor Sloan's legitimate business entities. It was 9:12 p.m. By the time all of this assembled itself into a complete picture, and Zuri was back in Black Harbor, sitting at a terminal again, this time with a coffee that was actually still warm. The room had a different texture tonight. The morning's measured professionalism had been replaced by something tighter. More people were in it. Conversations moved in lower registers. Min Jae had taken up a position near the center of the digital wall and wasn't moving from it. Ji-hoon stood behind Zuri's terminal and looked at the Sloan connection diagram she had built from the pieces Kevin Park and Thomas Carey had provided, cross-referenced with Dana's routing trace and Min Jae's law firm identification. "This is what 7 months of access looks like," she said. "He's not trying to steal from you. He's mapping you." Ji-hoon said nothing. The pharmaceutical vessel wasn't about the cargo. It was about testing whether a falsified authorization under my credentials would hold long enough to get through the first verification layer. She pointed at the diagram. "That's a probe. You run a probe like that when you're preparing for something larger, when you need to know exactly how the authentication system responds to a specific kind of pressure before you apply real pressure." Ji-hoon looked at the diagram. His face gave away nothing. But his hand, which had been resting on the edge of the workstation, closed once into a loose fist and opened again. "How much time?" he asked. If the merger filing hold triggered their revised timeline, she worked through the calculation. 72 hours might be what they were already planning around. The hold surprised them, they'll recalibrate. Could be faster. Then we have less time than we thought. Possibly. He moved away from her terminal and stood in the center of the room. The people at the workstations adjusted not obviously, but the way a room adjusts when the person who makes decisions moves to the center of it. "Full operational review," Ji-hoon said. Not loudly. He never spoke loudly in this room. Everything Sloan's people touched, every file they accessed, every route they observed, I want it mapped and isolated before morning. Nothing Sloan has seen should still be where he last saw it. The room moved, not scrambled moved, with the efficiency of people who had trained for exactly this contingency and were now inside it. Zuri started to stand. "Not you," Ji-hoon said. She looked at him. "I need you to look at something else." He led her to the far end of the room, the cluster of monitors she had noticed the previous night and had not been cleared for. He pulled up a single file on the center screen. She looked at the file name. Kang Succession Protocol. "Read the first section," he said. She read it. Then she read it again, because the first reading produced an interpretation that seemed impossible, and she had learned not to trust first readings when they returned impossible results. The second reading returned the same interpretation. She turned to look at him. "This transfers operational authority to me," she said. "If something happens to you." "Yes." "When did you write this?" "The framework was written 4 years ago. Your name was added 8 months ago." 8 months ago. 2 months before Kevin Park's debt had reached its critical threshold. 3 months before Thomas Carey had first accessed the pharmaceutical vessel's routing file. Almost a year before any of this had visible shape. "You knew something was coming," she said. "I knew something was always coming," he said. "That's different from knowing what." She looked at the file. At the language. It was not vague, it was precise the way that documents are precise when they have been through multiple revisions by people who understand what imprecise language costs. "I didn't agree to this," she said. "No," Ji-hoon said. "You didn't." The room hummed around them. The digital wall cycled through its continuous feed ships, routes, freight corridors, financial transfers, the vast circulatory system of an empire that she had believed she understood from one angle and was now understanding from several others simultaneously. She thought about the 37-second window, about a document in a legacy folder that no one had asked to read. She thought about 5 years of arriving before everyone else and leaving after everyone else, and a granola bar in a desk drawer, and 17 errors in a merger document, and a marble floor, and a ring placed like a receipt. She thought about the fact that a man she had worked beside for 5 years had been watching her with this in mind. "Why me?" she said. Ji-hoon looked at the file rather than at her when he answered. Because the qualities that make a person worth trusting in small moments are the same ones that matter in large ones. You had 5 years of small moments. That's not an answer. It's the only one I have, he said. She was still looking at the file when every monitor in Black Harbor went dark simultaneously. The darkness lasted 3 seconds. Then a single line of red text appeared across every screen in the room, identical, repeating, cycling through all 47 monitors on the digital wall in a slow, deliberate scroll. Checkmate Victor Sloan. The room went absolutely still. Min-jae was the first to move, crossing to the main operations terminal in 4 long strides. Dana Ko appeared from somewhere to Zuri's left, laptop already open. 3 of the security team members moved to the staircase, hands shifting toward positions that Zuri noted without fully processing. Ji-hoon stood at the center of the room. He was smiling. It was a small smile, controlled. The kind of expression that has very little to do with happiness and everything to do with recognition. The smile of a man who has just been handed confirmation of something he calculated for a long time and waited a long time to receive. He found the network, Min-jae said from the main terminal. He found the decoy, Ji-hoon said. The room turned toward him. 11 months ago, Ji-hoon said, we built a second network. Every account Sloan's people have been mapping for 7 months belongs to that network. Every shipping route they've been tracking. Every file they've stolen. Every secret they think they have. He let that sit for a moment. None of it is real. Zuri looked at the red text scrolling across 47 monitors and understood, in the way that understanding arrives sometimes not gradually but all at once, like a door opening rather than a lock turning that she was standing inside, a war that had been running for 11 months, and that the man standing beside her had been its architect the entire time, and that the pharmaceutical vessel and Thomas Carey and Kevin Park and the 70-2-hour filing hold were not the trap. They were the moment the trap closed. Victor Sloan had just declared checkmate on a board that Ji-hoon had designed specifically for him to believe he was winning. The city. And somewhere across the city, in whatever room Sloan was celebrating in, he did not yet know that the pieces he was holding were not the pieces he thought they were. The red text kept scrolling. Checkmate Victor Sloan. Zuri looked at it, and at Ji-hoon's controlled, precise smile, and felt the specific, vertiginous sensation of standing at the edge of something that was no longer containable, something that had already decided its own direction, and that she was now inside, whether she had agreed to be or not. The red text stopped scrolling at 9:47 p.m., not because someone turned it off. Stopped on its own, which was worse, because it meant whoever had sent it had written the script to terminate on a timer. Deliberate, theatrical, the kind of message that doesn't need a response, because it was never asking for one. Min-jae killed the display feed and brought the monitors back up on backup power in 90 seconds. The digital wall returned ships, routes, freight corridors, but the room didn't return with it. The room stayed in the particular suspended quality of people who have just watched something shift beneath them and are waiting to find out how far the ground has moved. Ji-hoon hadn't moved from the center of the room. He found the decoy, Dana said from her terminal. She was typing without looking at the keyboard, her eyes moving between 3 screens. But the access pattern, he didn't just find it. He burned through 6 layers of the decoy network in under 4 minutes. That's not someone stumbling onto a back door. That's someone who was given a map. The word landed in the room without drama, but everyone felt it. A map. Zuri was still at the far terminal, still looking at the succession protocol file, except she wasn't seeing it anymore. She was hearing the word map and running backwards through everything she had built. In the past 22 hours, the authentication gap, the access log, Thomas Carey, Kevin Park, the routing trace to the Hoboken server cluster, and looking for the thing she had missed. Someone told him about the decoy, she said. Someone who knew it existed, Ji-hoon said. How many people knew? Ji-hoon looked at Min-jae. Min-jae's jaw moved once. 6. Myself, Dana, 2 members of the technical build team, Richard Pace, and he stopped. Stop was too clean, too prepared. The stop of a man who had already completed this sentence in his head and didn't want to say the last word out loud. And who? Ji-hoon said. Min-jae looked at him directly, which was something he did only when the information he was carrying was serious enough that looking away would be a form of cowardice. And Clara Shin, he said. The name moved through the room the way a temperature drop moves not loudly, but felt everywhere simultaneously. Zuri didn't know the name. She looked at Dana, whose eyes had gone to the middle distance with the expression of someone doing rapid internal arithmetic on a problem they don't want the answer to. Who is Clara Shin? Zuri said. She said it as a statement rather than a question, because in this room, at this hour, with this specific quality of silence following a name, framing it as a question felt naive. Nobody answered immediately. Ji-hoon turned and walked toward the staircase. Not fast, he never moved fast in a way that suggested panic, but with the compressed, deliberate energy of a man rerouting. Bring up her access log, he said to Dana. Everything from the last 30 days. Ji-hoon, Min-jae said. Ji-hoon stopped, his back was to the room. Her last access was 40 minutes ago, Min-jae said. She pulled the Decoy Network's master architecture file at 9 p. 12 minutes before the message appeared on our screens. The room processed this. Zuri processed this. 40 monitors tracking the commercial infrastructure of a continent, and the thing that mattered most in this moment was a 12-minute gap between an access timestamp and a red message declaring checkmate. Where is she now? Ji-hoon asked, still not turning around. Her building access card last registered her, leaving through the freight entrance at 9:22. Ji-hoon turned around. His face was composed in the precise, controlled way that faces are composed when the composure is doing significant structural work. Tell me who she is, Zuri said again. It was Dana who answered, because Min-jae had the look of a man who couldn't. Clara Shin has been with the organization for 9 years, Dana said. Her voice was flat, the flatness of someone keeping emotion out of a factual delivery through effort rather than absence. She built the original Black Harbor communications infrastructure. Most of what you saw on that wall, when you first came here, the routing architecture, the freight tracking integration, the authentication framework, she designed it. Zuri let that sit for a moment. She designed my authentication framework, she said. She designed the predecessor system. You redesigned parts of it during the overhaul. The 37-second window. She wouldn't have known about that, Dana said. The overhaul was after she moved to the architecture division. She didn't have operational access to the new build. Zuri looked at the succession protocol file still open on her terminal. She thought about the document in the legacy folder, about what Clara Shin had known and what she hadn't, about the 12-minute gap. She didn't give Sloan the window, Zuri said slowly. She gave him everything else, everything up to the point where my rebuild started. She knew the shape of the system, but not the changes I made. Which is why the pharmaceutical vessel authorization failed, Dana said. And which is why Sloan thought he had more than he did, Zuri said. He was working from Clara's blueprint. Clara's blueprint was 8 months out of date. She stopped. Something was wrong with that conclusion. She could feel it before she could name it. She pulled up her own access log from the overhaul period. 14 months ago, she had worked on the overhaul for 11 weeks, primarily alone, occasionally with a junior tech she had requested and who had since transferred to the Singapore office. Clara Shin had not been in the project group, but 8 months ago, 3 months after the overhaul concluded, there had been a building-wide system migration. Routine, handled by the infrastructure team. Zuri had submitted her updated documentation as part of the migration compliance package to the infrastructure team, which Clara Shin had overseen. Zuri's hands went flat on the keyboard. She saw the overhaul documentation during the migration, she said. 8 months ago, Dana stopped typing. She saw it, Zuri said. She knew about the 37-second window. She had to. It was in the compliance package. The room went quiet in a different way than it had gone quiet before. The earlier silence had been the silence of uncertainty. This one was the silence of a conclusion, arriving from a direction no one had been watching. Then why did the authorization fail? Min-jae said. It wasn't quite a question. Zuri sat with that for 10 seconds. 15. The kind of silence that has texture. Because she didn't give Sloane the window, she said finally. She had it. She chose not to give it to him. Ji-hoon, who had been standing very still near the center of the room, looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read. She burned the decoy network, Min-jae said. She walked out the freight entrance 20 minutes ago. If she was protecting Zuri's window, why? Because they're not the same objective, Zuri said. Burning the decoy is about Sloane. Protecting the window is about something else. She looked at Ji-hoon. It's about you, she said. She gave Sloane enough to make his move, but kept the one piece that would have made the authorization hold. She wanted Sloane to advance, but she didn't want the pharmaceutical vessel to actually move. Why, Ji-hoon said, I don't know yet. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he turned to Min-jae. Find her. Min-jae was already on his phone. The next 40 minutes ran at 2 speeds simultaneously, the operational speed of Black Harbor, which was fast and technical and populated with people moving between terminals with the controlled urgency of a room that is practiced for contingencies, and Zuri's internal speed, which was slower, more angular, turning the Clara Shin problem in her hands, like the authentication gap looking for the seam. Dana pulled Clara's full access history, 9 years of it. The architecture work, the infrastructure builds, 17 major system overhauls, across as many years, several of which Zuri had used without knowing who had designed them. A woman who had built the nervous system of this organization from the inside, and then at some point had decided to do something else with that knowledge. When did her access pattern change? Zuri asked. Dana scrolled. Gradual shift, starting about 14 months ago. She starts pulling files outside her division's scope. Slowly nothing that would flag an automated review. 2 or 3 files a week over the pattern of normal architecture maintenance. 14 months ago, Zuri said. That was 3 months before the overhaul. 3 months before Zuri had redesigned the authentication framework. 3 months before the 37-second window had existed. She was already looking for something before the overhaul. Zuri said, before I changed anything. Sloane got to her before the overhaul, Dana said. Or she got to Sloane, Zuri said. The distinction was important, and neither of them knew which it was. Min-jae came back into the room at 10:34 p.m. He crossed directly to Ji-hoon, said something in a low voice that Zuri couldn't hear from across the room. Ji-hoon listened without expression. Min-jae finished. Ji-hoon nodded once. She's at the Hoboken address, Ji-hoon said to the room. The Hoboken address, the server cluster, the logistics consulting firm with no website and 3 registered employees, and a law firm that represented Victor Sloane's legitimate business entities. She hadn't run. She had gone there. Zuri stood up from her terminal. She went to him. She went to his infrastructure, Ji-hoon said. Whether Sloane is physically, there is a different question. You're going, she said. Yes, I'm coming. He looked at her. A sound like green wood splitting. It was the particular look of a man weighing 2 different kinds of risk against each other and not finding the calculation straightforward. You're not field trained, he said. Not dismissive. A fact. I built the authentication architecture, she compromised. If there's anything in that server cluster that needs to be interpreted in real time, you need me there. The calculation ran behind his eyes. Stay with Min-jae, he said. You don't move without him. She didn't argue. She put on her coat. The drive to Hoboken took 22 minutes. Zuri sat in the back of a black SUV between Min-jae and a security team member named Harrison, who said nothing for the entire drive and whose stillness was the professional kind, the kind that comes from training rather than temperament. Ji-hoon was in a separate vehicle ahead of them. She could see its taillights. She thought about Clara Shin for the entire 22 minutes. Not tactically, personally. A woman who had built something extraordinary and then spent 14 months dismantling her own architecture from the inside. That wasn't ideology. That wasn't loyalty to Sloane, or at least not primarily. People who pulled 2 or 3 files a week over 14 months, slowly, carefully, below the threshold of automated review, those were people with a specific objective, patient enough to work toward it over a long arc. What had Clara wanted? The Hoboken building was a converted industrial space on the waterfront, the kind of address that had accumulated 3 separate businesses in 10 years and retained the identity of none of them. The logistics consulting firm occupied the 2nd floor. The building had no doorman. The freight elevator was accessible with a standard key code. The key code had been in Kevin Park's confession. They went in through a service entrance on the ground floor. Harrison and 2 other members of the security team moved ahead. Min-jae stood beside Zuri in the way that people who have been told to protect something stay, close, slightly angled, making her peripheral rather than central. The 2nd floor was lit by monitor glow and nothing else. Clara Shin was sitting at a workstation in the center of the room. She was 44 years old, slight, with close-cropped hair, and the particular posture of someone who has been at a keyboard for a long time and whose body has stopped complaining about it. She did not look up when they entered. "I've been waiting," she said. Ji-hoon walked toward her and stopped 5 feet away. The security team spread to the room's perimeter. Min-jae kept his position beside Zuri. "Tell me why," Ji-hoon said. Clara looked at the monitor in front of her. On the screen was a file structure, the decoy network's architecture, laid open like a dissected thing. 17 people in this organization have died in the last 6 years, Clara said. Not in confrontations, not in accidents, in targeted actions by Sloan's network. She turned to look at Ji-hoon for the first time. "You know the number. You have a file on each of them. What you don't have is what I have, which is..." "Their names aren't the only thing in those files," Clara said. Sloan didn't move against them independently. He had information. Specific operational information that shouldn't have existed outside this building. She turned back to the monitor. "Someone inside your organization has been feeding Sloan targeting data for 6 years. Not Carey, not Park, someone much closer." The room held its breath. "You think you found Sloan's people," Clara said. "Carey and Park and the routing trace. You think that's the leak. It's not. Those are the surface. What's underneath has been in place since before I started pulling files. Since before your overhaul, since before your succession protocol, since before any of this." Ji-hoon said nothing. His hands were at his sides. "I went to Sloan's people 14 months ago because it was the only way to get close to the real source," Clara said. "I gave them what I had to give them in order to sit in this room, with this access, at this particular moment." "You gave them the decoy network," Ji-hoon said. "I gave them a map they believed was real. They used it to construct a raid that will never find what it's looking for." She pulled up a secondary file on the monitor beside her. "Because what they're actually looking for is this." The file was a communication log, 18 months of it. Encrypted, but Clara had already broken the encryption, and the content was visible in plain text message exchanges, coordinates, timing instructions. Operational communications between an inside source and Sloan's network. Zuri looked at the messages. She looked at the metadata. She looked at the sender identification embedded in the encryption header, which Clara had extracted, and which now sat at the top of the decrypted log in 12-point text. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at Ji-hoon. His face had changed. The composure was still there, but it was doing more work now. The difference between a load-bearing wall and a decorative one. The sender identification in the encryption header belonged to Richard Pace, head of internal compliance, the man who had sat across from her in the restricted meeting room that afternoon, saying the word regulatory with the particular emphasis of a man performing concern. The man whose compliance code she had used to lock down the 9th floor server room. The man who had been in Ji-hoon's inner circle long enough to know about the decoy network, long enough to have Sloan the map, long enough to have protected himself by layering Carey and Park and the external routing trace between himself and any direct connection. "How long?" Ji-hoon said. "The earliest message in the log is from 22 months ago," Clara said. "But there are references in the text to prior exchanges going back further. I'd estimate 4 years minimum." 4 years. Zuri did the calculation involuntarily. 4 years ago, Ji-hoon had begun developing her succession protocol. 4 years ago, someone inside his organization had begun feeding Victor Sloan the information required to eventually destroy it. Parallel timelines, one building toward something, one dismantling it. You couldn't bring this to me directly, Ji-hoon said. It wasn't an accusation. He was mapping the logic. Pace monitors internal communications. He has compliance override access to every secure channel in the building. If I had flagged this through normal channels, he would have seen it before you did. Clara closed the monitor slightly. I needed a path that didn't go through anything he could see. Sloan's network was the only one available. You used Sloan to run an investigation you couldn't run inside my organization, Ji-hoon said. Yes. And the pharmaceutical vessel. Was Sloan testing the authorization system? I knew it was coming. I chose not to prevent it because a successful test would have accelerated his timeline in a way that would have exposed Pace before he could obscure the log. Zuri heard this and looked at the succession protocol document still open on her phone, which she had photographed before leaving Black Harbor. She thought about a woman who had spent 14 months inside an enemy network, passing information carefully enough to remain trusted, holding back the one piece, the 37-second window that would have made the test succeed and the exposure disappear. Clara had been protecting the investigation by allowing the authorization to fail. She had been protecting the investigation, and she had been protecting Zuri, and she had never been able to say so to anyone. The 17 people in the targeting files, Zuri said. Clara looked at her. They had not spoken directly until this moment. Pace flagged them, Clara said. All 17. I have the correspondence. The air in the room changed again. Harris, near the far wall, shifted his weight. Min-jae's breathing, besides Zuri, was controlled and even too controlled. The evenness of someone managing something large in a small space. Ji-hoon stood very still. 17 people. 6 years. Compliance officer with override access to every secure channel in the building. Where is Pace now? Ji-hoon said. He left the Hedong Meridian building at 6:58 p. Clara said. His personal phone last pinged a cell tower in Midtown at 7:34. After that, nothing. He knows you found the log, Min-jae said. He knows something moved, Clara said. The server locked down this afternoon the 9th floor sweep. That would have registered as anomalous to his monitoring system. Zuri felt the cold arrive in her chest, the way cold arrives when the thing you did to protect something has inadvertently warned the person you were protecting it from. She had locked down the server room using Pace's compliance code. She had used it because it was available, because she knew it, because in the moment it had been the fastest path to the right outcome. Pace's compliance code, his own code, used on his own compliance infrastructure. He had received an alert. The server locked down, she said. Her voice was steady. She made it steady. It went to him. Usage of a compliance code generates an automatic notification to the code holder, Clara said. She wasn't saying it cruelly. She said it the way you say something that is simply true and also terrible. Zuri had warned him. Not intentionally, not through any failure of judgment she could have prevented, without knowledge she hadn't had. But the cause and effect were exact and direct, and she was at one end of it. Ji-hoon did not look at her when she said it. That was worse than if he had. We have the log, Min-jae said. Even with Pace running, the log is documented evidence. We bring this through legitimate channels. He'll have contingencies, Ji-hoon said. A man who has been running this for 4 years inside a compliance infrastructure has contingencies for the moment the log surfaces. What kind of contingencies? Min-jae said. The kind that require a compliance officer, Ji-hoon said. He can flag the log as fabricated. He can initiate a review of the authentication chain used to access this server cluster. He can challenge the jurisdiction of any agency we attempt to route this through, because he has relationships with the same regulatory bodies we'd be filing with. He paused. He built those relationships. That was his value to Sloan. Not the targeting data, the regulatory access. Zuri looked at the communication log on the monitor. 18 months of operational messages. Potentially 4+ years of prior exchanges they didn't have. A man with compliance override access and regulatory relationships who was now in motion and unreachable by phone. She thought about the 72-hour filing hold she had put in place that afternoon. Procedurally flawless, completely defensible, the hold that Pace would have known about because it had generated a compliance notification. He had known about the hold for hours. He had left the building at 6:58 p. The hold expired in less than 60 hours. He's going to use the filing window, she said. He doesn't need to attack the log directly. He just needs to reach the regulatory contacts before we do, and position the log as part of a disinformation campaign. If he gets there first, the communication log becomes evidence of our fabrication rather than his treason. Ji-hoon looked at her. How long do we have, he said. She ran the calculation. Regulatory office business hours. The review initiation process. How long it would take a man with Pace's specific relationships to get the right conversation in front of the right person before the filing hold created formal grounds for scrutiny. If he moves tonight, maybe 14 hours before he can put something in front of a contact that sticks. It's 9 p.m., Min-jae said. Then 14 hours from approximately now, she said. Ji-hoon turned to Clara, the prior exchanges. The 4 years of communications you believe exist beyond this log. Is there a way to access them? Possibly, Clara said. Sloan's network has an archival server I was never given direct access to, but I know where it routes. If you can get me a physical connection point within the next 3 hours, I can attempt an extraction. Where is the connection point? The Haedong Meridian building, Clara said. Specifically, the Compliance Division server room. The Compliance Division server room. Richard Pace's professional home territory. A room that, as of 7:34 p.m., Pace had vacated along with his physical presence in Manhattan. A room that was still locked down from the 9th floor sweep. Zuri's own lockdown. Using Pace's own code, she had locked him out of his own server room without knowing she was doing it. The lockdown is still active, she said. Min-jae looked at her. Yes, he can't access it remotely without the code. Not without the physical override, Min-jae said, which requires his key card, which stopped registering at 9:22 p.m. in the Midtown cell tower area. He was locked out of the room that might contain the evidence that destroyed him. And the person who could enter it, whose compliance code was active and whose operational access was intact, was standing in a converted industrial space in Hoboken with wet pavement visible through the windows, and approximately 14 hours before Richard Pace reached a regulatory contact and made the last 4 years of betrayal disappear. Ji-hoon looked at Zuri. She looked at him. She thought about the succession protocol file, about what it meant to be chosen for a role she had never applied for by a man she was still in the process of understanding, inside a situation she had entered through a boardroom floor and a paper cut and a ring placed like a receipt. She thought about 37 seconds, about the gap between what an enemy knows and what they don't. About 14 hours. I need to get back into that server room, she said. Yes, Ji-hoon said, and I need Clara to tell me exactly what I'm looking for before we go in, because once we're in, we won't have time for ambiguity. Clara looked at her with the specific measuring attention of someone encountering a person they have observed from a distance for a long time and are now meeting at the same elevation. Sit down, Clara said. Zuri sat. For the next 40 minutes, Clara told her everything: the archive structure, the file naming conventions, the authentication pathway, Sloan's network used for the archival server, the specific folder hierarchy that would contain the earliest communications, the timestamp format that would allow them to establish the 4-year timeline. Told it methodically, with the precision of someone who had been holding this information in a compressed state for a long time and was finally releasing it into a space where it could be used. Zuri wrote nothing down. She held it in the way she held things that mattered, by understanding the logic rather than the surface, by building the map rather than memorizing the roads. At 11:53 p.m., they left the Hoboken building. Clara came with them. Harrison drove. The city outside the windows had gone to the specific quiet of a Wednesday night past midnight, the quiet of a place that has commerce and ambition running at all hours, but stores them underground after a certain point, visible only in the lit windows of buildings that don't sleep. The Haedong Meridian building's lobby was empty except for Gerald. Gerald looked at Zuri when she came through the main entrance. He looked at the people around her. He looked at Ji-hoon in a way that suggested Gerald was a man who had been at this desk long enough to understand that the chairman arriving at midnight with a group of people who moved the way this group moved was not a routine occurrence, and who had arrived at an age where unusual occurrences did not require him to perform surprise. "Ms. Bennett," he said. "Gerald," she said. "Granola bars in the drawer if you need it." She almost laughed. It came up in her chest and she held it there, and it was a strange thing to hold something close to warmth in the middle of everything that was trying to be cold. "Thanks," she said, and kept moving. The Compliance Division server room was on the 9th floor, down a corridor from the locked main office. The lockdown was still active. The compliance code worked. The door opened. The room was what server rooms always were: cool, loud with the white noise of equipment cooling, lit by indicator lights and the blue-white of overhead fluorescents. Racks of equipment along 3 walls. A central terminal. Clara moved to the central terminal and began. Min Jae stood at the door. Ji-hoon stood in the center of the room, which was where he always stood, and watched. Zuri watched Clara work and thought about 14 hours and about the regulatory contacts Pace was moving toward right now, somewhere in the city, building a story in which the communication log was a fabrication, and the people standing in this server room were the threat. She thought about how a man constructs that story. What he needs, what he says to whom, in what order, with what documentation. She thought about Richard Pace's compliance code, his own code, used on his own infrastructure, generating an automatic notification to him. The notification had gone to his phone. His phone had last pinged a midtown cell tower at 7:34 p. She looked at the equipment racks. She looked at the terminal where Clara was working. She looked at the room the way she looked at authentication systems, not at the visible architecture but at the seams. There was a secondary terminal in the far corner, smaller, less integrated than the main one. She crossed to it. It was a standalone access point, the kind of machine that exists in compliance infrastructure as an audit terminal used for reviewing access logs without generating entries in the main system. She logged in with her own credentials. She pulled the notification delivery log for compliance code usage. Standard administrative function, accessible to senior operations staff. She found the notification that had been generated by the 9th floor lockdown. It had been delivered to Pace's registered phone at 4:23 p.m. that afternoon, and it had been read, and 23 minutes after it was read, at 4:46 p.m. Before Pace had left the building, before his phone had gone dark, before any of the evening's events had unfolded, a file transfer had been initiated from Pace's compliance terminal. She looked at the destination of the file transfer. It was an external address, encrypted. She didn't have the key, but the file that had been transferred was named in the compliance system's outgoing log. It was named Kang's Succession Protocol. Zuri looked at the file name for a long time. Then she looked at Ji-hoon. He was already looking at her. He had been watching her at the audit terminal, and something in her face had told him before she could say it. "He has the succession protocol," she said. "He transferred it at 4:46 p.m. before he left." The room went very still. "Sloan knows about me," she said. "He knows what the protocol says. He knows that if something happens to you." She stopped, because she understood now what Sloan's next move was, and it was not the regulatory contacts, or not only those, and it was not the communication log challenge, and it was not anything that involved the merger filing, or the authentication system, or the decoy network. Victor Sloan had just received a document telling him that the single most efficient way to acquire operational control of Kang Ji-hoon's organization was not to destroy Ji-hoon. It was to destroy Zuri, and she had no idea how much time she had before he tried. She said it once and didn't repeat it. Ji-hoon moved first. Not toward her, toward Min Jae. 3 steps, a word in Korean she didn't catch, and Min Jae was on his phone before Ji-hoon finished the sentence. Clara, still at the main terminal, had stopped working. She was looking at the audit screen over Zuri's shoulder, with the expression of a woman doing the same calculation Zuri had just completed and arriving at the same answer. "He'll move tonight," Clara said. "If he has the protocol, he knows the transfer of authority mechanism. He knows it's contingent on Ji-hoon's death or incapacitation. He's been waiting for a leverage point. He just got one. He doesn't need to kill me to use it," Ji-hoon said. He said it with the flat precision of a man stating a logistical fact rather than a personal one. "He needs to remove me from operational capacity. Discrediting, arrest, regulatory seizure, any of those triggers the incapacitation clause." "The regulatory contacts," Zuri said. "That's the clean version," Ji-hoon said. Sloan has never been interested in the clean version. Min-jae came back into the room. "Three of our people on the perimeter reported a vehicle that's been circling the block since 11:40. Black sedan, rotating plates. It stopped moving 8 minutes ago. Parked on the north side. The building they were already here." Zuri looked at the audit terminal, at the file transfer log. At the timestamp 4:46 p.m., that meant Sloan had known about her for more than 7 hours. 7 hours to plan. 7 hours to position people. 7 hours to decide how he wanted to use the information in the succession protocol against an organization that would, the moment Ji-hoon was gone, legally belong to her. She thought about what that meant practically. A woman with no criminal organization experience established relationships with the people Ji-hoon's empire ran on, no history in the world that lived beneath Haedong Meridian's public face. An organization handed to someone like that was an organization that could be absorbed in 30 days by someone patient enough to wait and aggressive enough to move the moment the transfer completed. She was not an inheritor. She was a gap in the defenses. That was what Sloan had purchased with the succession protocol. "What do they want?" she said. "Tonight. What's the actual objective?" "You," Ji-hoon said. "Or me. Either satisfies the mechanism." "They'd rather have me," she said. "If they take you, the organization fights back. If they take me and discredit the protocol itself, challenge it as coerced, fraudulent, outside legitimate succession law, the authority structure collapses, and there's no one position to hold it together." Ji-hoon looked at her with the specific attention of a man who is hearing his own analysis returned to him from a direction he didn't expect. "Yes," he said, "so I'm the softer target. You were until approximately 45 minutes ago." She didn't know what had changed 45 minutes ago, and she didn't ask, because the server room was not the place for that conversation, and they had less time than either of them had said out loud. "Clara needs the archive extraction," Zuri said. "How long?" 40 minutes minimum, Clara said. "An authentication path holds." "Can she work from somewhere else in the building?" Min-jae looked at Ji-hoon. Ji-hoon looked at Clara. Clara looked at the main terminal she was currently occupying and made the rapid assessment of a woman who has been making rapid assessments in server rooms for 9 years. "I need this terminal's direct connection," Clara said. "The archive routing goes through PACE's compliance access point. I can't replicate that remotely." "Then she stays here," Ji-hoon said. "Harrison stays with her." He looked at Zuri. "Come with me." "Where?" "Not here," he said. She understood. Staying in the building was staying in the location Sloan's people had already mapped. The vehicle outside. The rotating plates. 7 hours of preparation by a man who had just been handed the operational map of everything he needed. They left Clara and Harrison in the server room. Min-jae came with them. 2 additional security team members Zuri didn't know, by name, flanked the elevator, then moved ahead through the lobby. Gerald was still at the desk. He looked at them coming through and picked up his phone without being asked. "I'll call it in," he said. He meant the vehicle outside. He said it with the tone of a man who had staffed a lobby long enough to understand that some nights required him to know things he officially didn't know. Ji-hoon paused beside the desk. "Thank you, Gerald." "Go," Gerald said. They went out through the freight exit on the building's south side. The air outside was cold and smelled like rain that had fallen 3 hours ago, and pavement that hadn't dried yet. Min-jae moved to a vehicle that had been repositioned to the south entrance, not the same SUV they'd come in. Different plates, different color. Zuri got in. the door closed. The vehicle moved. For approximately 90 seconds, the only sounds were the engine and Min-jae on a radio channel caught she didn't have context for. Then Min-jae lowered the radio and turned to Ji-hoon. "Pace made contact," he said. 20 minutes ago. One of our people in the Federal Financial Crimes Division received a filing emergency injunction request, citing evidence of fraudulent succession documentation inside Haedong Meridian. He's naming you specifically. He looked at Ji-hoon, and he's naming Zuri as a co-conspirator in the fraud. The vehicle kept moving. Outside the city did its midnight thing indifferent, lit, populated with people who had no idea. Zuri listened to the word co-conspirator settle into the air and thought about what it meant architecturally. Pace wasn't just positioning the succession protocol as fraudulent. He was positioning her as an active participant in the fraud, which meant any authority she had under the protocol became evidence of the scheme rather than a legitimate transfer, which meant Ji-hoon's organization would be in a legal freeze the moment the injunction was accepted, which meant Sloan could move on the frozen assets with a competing claim structured through his shell entities, and the organization would be fighting on two fronts simultaneously, the legal freeze and Sloan's acquisition, with no clear authority figure able to make binding decisions. It was elegant in the cold way that destruction is sometimes elegant when someone has had 4 years to design it. He needs the injunction accepted before Clara finishes the archive extraction, Zuri said. If we can document the prior communications before the injunction is formally filed, we have grounds to challenge the emergency filing as itself fraudulent. How long does acceptance take? Ji-hoon asked Min-jae. Emergency injunction in financial crimes with a pre-existing regulatory relationship and supporting documentation 3 to 5 hours. Faster if Pace's contact expedites. And Clara needs 40 minutes, Zuri said. Clara needed 40 minutes ago, Ji-hoon said. She's been working. Zuri looked at her phone. 12:31 a.m. Clara had been in the server room since approximately 12:10, which meant if the 40-minute estimate held, she had roughly 10 minutes remaining. Her phone buzzed. The number was unfamiliar. She looked at Ji-hoon. He nodded. She answered, "Ms. Bennett." The voice on the other end was male, even, and had the particular practiced quality of someone who conducts difficult conversations professionally. "My name isn't important. What's important is that you understand your current situation accurately, which I don't believe you do." She said nothing. She looked out the window. Min-jae had his own phone out and was already running a trace. "The succession protocol is a liability," the voice said. "Not to Mr. Kang, to you. Whatever he told you about why he chose you, I'm sure it was compelling. Men in his position are very good at compelling narratives. But the document you signed makes you responsible for an organization with significant legal exposure across 4 jurisdictions, and the moment his name is removed from the operational picture, that exposure transfers to you personally." "Is that all?" she said. A pause. The voice had expected something else. Question, a denial, a negotiation opener. "There's an alternative," it said. "You withdraw from the succession arrangement voluntarily. Tonight, on record. You cooperate with the injunction process by providing a statement confirming the protocol was executed under duress. In exchange, your personal liability is indemnified, and you're free to resume your career without the complications of." "Of what?" she said. "Of being the public face of an organization that is about to be the subject of a very long and very visible federal investigation." She held the phone against her ear and looked at Ji-hoon, who was watching her face. "Think about it," she said, and ended the call. Ji-hoon waited. "They want me to withdraw from the protocol voluntarily," she said. "Sign a statement that it was coerced. Tonight, will you?" She looked at him. The question was direct, and he had asked it without inflection, not challenging, not rhetorical, genuinely asking. "No," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked forward. "Then we need Derek Halston," he said. She hadn't expected that name in this vehicle at this hour. It landed with the particular weight of something she had put down carefully and not planned to pick up again. "Derek," she said. "His testimony about Sloan's recruitment approach documents the external operation. Combined with Clara's archive extraction, it establishes the 4-year conspiracy independent of the succession protocol. Pace can challenge the protocol. He can't challenge a documented conspiracy that predates his own injunction filing. Derek doesn't know anything about Clara or the archive, Zuri said. He knows about Sloane's financial recruitment methods. He knows about the offshore account structure Sloane used to pay him. He knows the names of 3 other individuals Sloane recruited through the same mechanism, 2 of whom work in regulatory agencies. Ji-hoon looked at her. He gave that information in Black Harbor 3 days ago. He gave it because he was frightened and finished, and had nothing left to protect. That testimony is documented. We need him to repeat it on record formally in the next 4 hours. He won't, she said. He might. He humiliated me in front of 14 people and a marble floor, she said. He did it because he thought it cost him nothing. Men like that don't cooperate unless the cost of not cooperating is worse than the cost of cooperating. Cost of not cooperating, Ji-hoon said, is a federal conspiracy charge in the jurisdiction of a financial crimes division that currently has his cooperation agreement on file as a tentative rather than a finalized instrument. Zuri processed that. You left the agreement tentative deliberately. It gave us a mechanism for exactly this. She looked out the window again. In a federal holding arrangement, with a tentative agreement that could be finalized or revoked depending on the degree of his cooperation in the next 4 hours. She thought about the ring placed like a receipt, about not wife material, about the marble floor and the paper cut and the 14 people who said nothing. She thought about what it would cost her, personally, to be in a room with Derek Halston and ask him for something. Where is he, she said. A location Minjai can access in 20 minutes, Ji-hoon said. She looked at her phone. 12:38 a.m. Clara had maybe 2 minutes left on her extraction estimate, plus or minus the authentication path holding. Pace's injunction was in a 3 to 5 hour processing window. 4 hours to Derek's formal testimony, assuming Derek cooperated at all, which was not a certainty and was not going to be easy. Okay, she said. But I talked to him. Ji-hoon looked at her. He won't respond to Minjai, she said. He won't respond to your security team or to a formal interrogation structure. He'll perform. He'll calculate. He'll say as little as possible and protect what he thinks he can still protect. She looked at Ji-hoon steadily. He'll respond to me because whatever else Derek Halston is, he spent 14 months telling me I was insufficient, and I think some part of him needs me to know he's sorry. People like that cooperate when the person they wronged is looking at them. Ji-hoon was quiet for a moment. 5 minutes, he said. You get 5 minutes with him alone before Minjai comes in. 10, 7, done, she said. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was Harrison's number, she answered. Clara's in, Harrison said. She has the archive. She's compressing the extraction now. 12 minutes for the full package. Zuri exhaled. It came out longer than she intended. Tell her to send the compression to Dana the moment it's complete, she said. Direct to Dana's secured terminal at Black Harbor. Not through Haedong Meridian's main infrastructure. Already told, Harrison said. Clara's ahead of you. She ended the call and told Ji-hoon. He didn't visibly react. But his right hand, which had been resting against his leg with the controlled stillness he maintained in almost every situation, uncurled slightly. One finger, then the next. The particular release of a man who has been holding a specific tension for a long time and has just received permission to release a fraction of it. The vehicle stopped 12 minutes later, in front of a building in Lower Manhattan that had the unremarkable face of a mid-range corporate residence, the kind of building that accommodates people who are between permanent situations and have enough money not to be uncomfortable about it. Minjai led them through a side entrance and up 4 flights of stairs that smelled like someone's cooking from 3 hours earlier. Derek was in a room on the 4th floor, not a cell. A serviceable, anonymous room with 2 chairs and a small table and a window that faced a wall. He was sitting in one of the chairs when they opened the door, and he looked up with the particular expression of a man who has been waiting for something bad to arrive and is doing the arithmetic on whether this specific thing is as bad as what he imagined. He looked at Zuri. Something moved across his face. Not shame or not only shame, something more complicated. It's the expression of a person confronting the distance between who they performed themselves to be and who they actually were, in the presence of the person most qualified to make the comparison. Ji Yi-hoon and Min Jae stayed in the corridor. The door stayed open enough for them to see in, but far enough that the room had the texture of a private conversation. Zuri sat in the second chair. Derek looked at his hands. "Zuri, don't," she said. He stopped. "I'm not here for an apology," she said. "I'm not here because I want to hear you explain yourself. I'm here because you have information that I need in a documented formal statement in the next 3.5 hours. And whether you give it to me determines whether a federal agreement that is currently protecting you from a conspiracy charge gets finalized or revoked." Derek looked up from his hands. "The offshore account structure Sloan used to recruit you," she said. "The names of the other individuals he recruited through the same mechanism. The regulatory agency employees you mentioned when you were interviewed. I need all of that in a recorded statement, specific enough to cross-reference tonight." Derek's mouth opened, closed. He was doing the calculation she had predicted, how much he could withhold, what the minimum cooperation looked like, where the walls of the thing were. "What happens to me," he said. "That depends on how specific you are." Derek. She said his name the way she had learned to say the names of things that no longer had power over her clearly, without the performance of grievance. "I spent 14 months convincing myself that what we had was worth protecting. I was wrong about that. I've made peace with being wrong about it. What I haven't made peace with is a man with regulatory connections trying to dismantle a 4-year investigation using an injunction he filed an hour ago, and I need your statement to prevent that from working." So, she looked at him directly. "How specific are you willing to be?" He held her gaze for longer than she expected. She watched him do something she had not anticipated. She watched him stop calculating. The specific moment when a person stops managing a situation and just inhabits it. His shoulders dropped approximately half an inch. His hands, which had been arranged on the table with the careful self-consciousness of a man aware of how he looked, relaxed into something closer to their natural position. "The names I gave before," he said. "The 2 in the regulatory agencies." "Yes. There's a third," he said. I didn't give the third because I thought there was a chance I was wrong about them. I don't think that anymore." She pulled out her phone and opened the recording application. She placed it on the table between them. She didn't ask if he was ready. She just looked at him. Derek talked for 22 minutes. He was specific. More specific than the initial interview in Black Harbor names, dates, transaction amounts, the particular offshore routing structure Sloan used that moved through 3 shell entities before reaching any individual account. He described a meeting in a hotel conference room in D.C. where he had been introduced to the 3rd regulatory contact directly, by name, with Sloan present. He described the document Sloan had shown him, not the succession protocol, something earlier. Financial liability analysis of Haedong Meridian's exposure across 4 jurisdictions that was so accurate it could only have come from inside the organization. Richard Pace had prepared that analysis. Derek hadn't known that at the time. He'd said so clearly, in the recording, which was what made it useful. His ignorance of Pace's identity was itself evidence of the compartmentalization. Sloan used to keep his inside sources protected from his outside recruiters. When Derek finished, Zuri picked up her phone and stopped the recording. She sent it to Min Jae's secured line. She sent a copy to Dana at Black Harbor. She sent a 3rd copy to a legal contact she had used during the merger, not Ji-hoon's attorney, but an independent one she had consulted personally, with a message that said, "Document receipt and timestamp this. I'll explain in the morning." She stood up. Derek looked at her from his chair. The calculation was gone from his face. What was left was something she didn't want to identify too precisely because identifying it required giving him more of her attention than the situation warranted. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know," she said, and left. Ji-hoon was in the corridor, he had heard. She could tell from the specific quality of his stillness. The stillness of a man who has been listening and is finished processing what he heard and is waiting for the next thing. "The third name," Min Jae said. He already had his phone out. Run it, she said. They moved. Back in the vehicle, the next 40 minutes were a controlled collapse of the architecture. Sloan and Pace had spent hours constructing. Dana received the archive extraction from Clara at 1:14 a.m. 4 years of prior communications, complete, authenticated, the time-stamped chain unbroken. Min Jae's contact in the Federal Financial Crimes Division received Derek's recorded statement at 1:31 a.m. and confirmed receipt at 1:33. At 1:47, the emergency injunction filed by Richard Pace was formally contested by Ji-hoon's legal team on grounds of bad faith filing, with the archived communication log submitted as supporting documentation. The injunction examiner reached at home at 1:52 a.m. by a legal team that did not use the words Koreanophia, but that communicated the essential seriousness of the situation with the clarity that 4 years of documented conspiracy tends to provide, suspended the injunction review pending authentication of the submitted materials. Pending authentication meant Pace had lost his 3 to 5 hour window. It did not mean Sloan had stopped moving at 2:09 a.m. 3 things happened within 90 seconds of each other. Jay received a report that the black sedan outside the Haidong Meridian building had been joined by 2 additional vehicles, and that all 3 had moved simultaneously toward the building's freight entrance. Harrison called to say that Clara had finished transmitting the archive and was ready to leave the server room, but that the corridor outside had 2 unfamiliar individuals in it who had not used the elevator and were not responding to his identification challenges. And Zuri's phone rang with a number she didn't recognize, and this time, when she answered, the voice on the other end was not the measured professional from before. This time, it was Victor Sloan. She knew his name before he said it because she had heard it enough times in the past 4 days that it had acquired the specific texture of something real rather than reference the texture of a person rather than a designation. "You've been busy," he said. His voice was lower than she expected. Not the voice of a man performing menace. The voice of a man who had been awake for a long time and was done with the intermediate steps. "Yes," she said. "The injunction will be reinstated," he said. "Pace has contingencies I haven't used yet, but that's not why I'm calling." She waited. "I'm calling because I want you to understand something before this gets worse," Sloan said. Ji-hoon built something impressive. I'll acknowledge that. But he built it around himself, his relationships, his reputation, his specific way of holding things together. The succession protocol is a fantasy. You can't inherit that. You can document it. You can legalize it. You can stand in front of shareholders and receive applause. But the thing that actually holds his organization together is him. Without him, what you have is a piece of paper and a room full of people who are about to receive better offers. She looked at Ji-hoon sitting beside her in the vehicle. He was watching her face. "Tell me why you're calling," she said. "Because I can take the organization apart over the next 6 months through legal and financial attrition. Or I can take it apart tonight," Sloan said. "Tonight is faster but messier. I'd rather not do it tonight if you give me a reason not to." "What reason?" "Step away from the protocol. Voluntarily. Tonight. On record. I have a filing ready that converts the succession arrangement into a corporate governance dispute rather than a criminal conspiracy. Ji-hoon survives it. You survive it. The organization restructures under a board arrangement that includes my people, and the fighting stops. And you get the infrastructure," she said. "I get a seat at the table," he said. "Which is what I've always wanted. I'm not interested in a war. Wars are expensive." "Then stop the vehicles outside my building," she said. Pause. "That's a precautionary measure," he said. "It's a threat," she said. "You're calling to negotiate while 3 vehicles are positioned at a freight entrance and 2 of your people are in a corridor trapping mine. That's not a man who wants to avoid a war. That's a man who wants to win one while talking about something else." The line was quiet for 3 seconds. "You have an hour," Sloan said. "Think carefully about what you're protecting and whether it's worth what comes next." The line went dead. Ji-hoon held his hand out. She gave him the phone. He looked at the call log, then gave it to Min Jae, who was already doing something with it that she didn't ask about. Harris and Ji-hoon said to Min-jae. Working on it, Min-jae said. The two people in the corridor, Ji-hoon said. Our team is 4 floors above them. They go for the server room. We'll know in advance. They're not going for the server room, Zuri said. Both men looked at her. The archive is already extracted. Sloan knows that he was listening to this conversation, or his people were. The server room is irrelevant now. Those 2 people in the corridor are there for Clara. Min-jae moved the phone to his ear and said 3 words she didn't catch. Ji-hoon looked at her. Sloan gave you an hour. He gave me an hour to think, she said. He's moving now, yes. He'll go for Clara first, she said. Clara can testify to the archive's authenticity. Without her testimony, the archive is a collection of documents without a chain of custody witness. He can challenge the authentication. Min-jae has already moved additional personnel to Clara's floor, Ji-hoon said. She's not alone. How many people does Sloan have in that building right now? Ji-hoon looked at Min-jae, who lowered his phone. Best estimate 6, Min-jae said. 3 in the vehicles outside, 2 in the corridor. 1 unaccounted for. 1 unaccounted for. She thought about that. She thought about 7 hours, about a man who had received the succession protocol at 4:46 p. and had spent 7 hours preparing for this specific night. 6 visible people was a deployment, not a full operation. A man who had been planning this for 4 years and had 7 hours to execute it did not put all of his resources in visible positions. The unaccounted person isn't in the building, she said. Min-jae looked at her. They're positioned somewhere between us and the building, she said. Sloan doesn't want a confrontation inside too much documentation risk, too many witnesses. He wants Ji-hoon away from the building and accessible. The vehicle was on West Street, 4 blocks from the Haedong Meridian building, moving north. Stop the car, she said. The driver looked at Min-jae. Min-jae looked at Ji-hoon. Ji-hoon said stop. The vehicle stopped. Zuri looked out the window at the street. Rain from earlier still sat in pools at the gutters. The streetlights made them look like mirrors laid flat on the ground. A block ahead, a delivery truck was parked on the right side with its hazard lights running, which meant nothing or meant something depending on what you were looking for. The delivery truck, she said. Min-jae was already on the radio. The response came back. In 11 seconds, the delivery truck's plates had been registered to a freight company that dissolved 18 months ago. Ji-hoon looked at the truck, looked at Zuri. You have good instincts, he said. I have a pattern, she said. The pharmaceutical vessel. The counterfeit authorization. The routing trace through 3 anonymizing layers. Sloan doesn't attack directly. He uses the infrastructure he's built to make the attack look like something else. The truck isn't an ambush. It's a documentation point. Someone in that truck is filming this vehicle right now. And whatever happens in the next 20 minutes, Sloan has footage that he can use to construct a narrative about Ji-hoon's movements tonight. For the injunction, Min-jae said. For the injunction. For the regulatory review. For whatever Pace's contingency requires in terms of supporting visual documentation. She looked at the truck. He's building a record. The people in the building are a distraction. This is the actual move. Ji-hoon was very still. If we approach the truck, she said, we give him what he wants, confrontational footage. Ji-hoon's face, something that looks like the behavior of a man with something to hide. And if we don't approach it, Min-jae said, he has footage of this vehicle sitting stationary a block away, which can be edited to suggest surveillance, planning, intent. There's a third option, she said. Both men looked at her. She took Ji-hoon's phone from Min-jae's hand. She opened the camera. She stepped out of the vehicle. The rain had left the air cold and sharp. She could feel it on the back of her neck and through the fabric of her coat at the shoulders. Her shoes were wrong for wet pavement. She'd been wearing them since the boardroom 2 days ago. A different version of this city, a different version of herself, and the first step onto the gutter's edge sent cold water across her left foot. She walked toward the truck, not fast, not aggressive. She walked the way she walked to a terminal when she already knew what she was going to find, with the measured pace of someone who has done the calculation and is now implementing the conclusion. She raised the phone and took a photograph of the truck. Then she walked to the driver's side window, which was dark, and knocked. No response. She took a photograph of the plate. She turned and took a photograph of the street, both directions, the vehicle behind her, the building 2 blocks north, the pools of water reflecting the streetlights. She texted all 4 photographs to Dana with a single line, timestamp and geolocate. "Do it now," Dana responded in 45 seconds. "Done." Tagged and logged, Zuri turned and walked back to the vehicle. Her foot was wet and cold, and the paper cut on her fingers had reopened sometime in the past hour without her noticing, a thin line of dried blood along the edge of her index finger. She got back in. Ji-hoon looked at her. "He has footage of me," she said. "I have footage of him." Dana has time-stamped, geolocated documentation of his surveillance vehicle in the context of a contested injunction filing, which means anything that truck's footage shows tonight can be contextualized against evidence of a coordinated surveillance operation against the people he's trying to implicate. Min-jae exhaled. It was almost not audible. "You want to keep moving," Ji-hoon said. "I want to get to the building," she said. "Clara needs to get out, and we need to be present when the archive authentication is formally submitted. Sloane's hour is a negotiating fiction he's going to move before it expires." Ji-hoon told the driver to move. The vehicle pulled away from the delivery truck. In the side mirror, Zuri watched it stay where it was hazard lights, blinking their patient, mechanical rhythm against the wet street. Her phone showed 2:31 a.m. Clara's extraction was with Dana. Derek's testimony was logged and time-stamped. The surveillance truck was documented. The injunction was suspended pending authentication review. Richard Pace was somewhere in the city, moving, unreachable, in possession of contingencies they hadn't seen yet. And Victor Sloane had given her an hour that would run out in approximately 29 minutes, and whatever he had planned for the moment it expired was already in motion, already positioned, already running on a timer she couldn't see from where she was sitting. The Haedong Meridian building appeared ahead of them through the windshield, its upper floors lit against the dark sky, its lobby a warm rectangle of light in the lower face of the structure, Gerald visible through the glass as a single still figure at the front desk, and the 3 vehicles that had been circling the building were gone. Min-jae saw it at the same moment she did. "They pulled back," he said. His voice had a particular quality, not relief, not suspicion exactly, but the heightened attention of a man who understands that an enemy retreating without a reason is more dangerous than an enemy advancing. "Why?" she said. Min-jae looked at Ji-hoon. Ji-hoon looked at the building. Gerald was no longer at the front desk. The lobby was empty. "Stop the car," Ji-hoon said, and his voice had changed, not louder, but stripped of the careful modulation he maintained as a matter of discipline, down to something underneath it, something that moved Zuri's nervous system before her mind caught up with why. The vehicle stopped. Min-jae was already out of the door before it fully finished moving, hand at his side, moving toward the lobby entrance with the compressed, purposeful stride of a man who has assessed a situation and reached a conclusion that requires immediate physical presence. Ji-hoon put his hand on the door handle. Zuri put her hand on his arm. He stopped. She looked at the empty lobby, at the space where Gerald had been, the 3 vehicles that had retreated, and the 2 individuals who had been in the corridor, and Sloane's unaccounted 6th person, and the hour that was running out. "He moved everyone," she said. He pulled the vehicles back. He cleared the outside presence. "He's not coming from outside." Ji-hoon looked at her. "He's already inside," she said. Ji-hoon was out of the vehicle before she finished the sentence. She was right behind him, and she knew it was the wrong tactical decision, and she made it anyway. Because the alternative was splitting, because the alternative was sitting in a car, while the building that contained Gerald and Harrison and 4 years of assembled evidence was being handled by people whose interests ran directly counter to every person inside it. Min-jae had already reached the lobby entrance. He held up a fist stop without turning around. Ji-hoon stopped. Zuri stopped 2 steps behind him on the wet pavement, her breath visible in the cold air, her left foot still damp from the gutter. Min Jae pushed the lobby door open with his shoulder and went through it in the low-angled way of a man who has been trained not to present a profile. 3 seconds of silence. Then Min Jae's voice from inside, clear. They went in. Gerald was behind the security desk, seated, with his hands flat on the surface in front of him, and the specific stillness of a man who has been told not to move and has decided that compliance is the correct strategy. A thin cut above his left eyebrow had bled and dried into a dark line. He was looking at the elevator bank when they entered, and when he turned and saw Zuri, something in his face shifted from the controlled blankness of managed fear back into something that had more weather in it. "There are 3 of them," Gerald said. "One stayed down here until about 4 minutes ago." "Went up. Which floor?" Ji-hoon said. "9th," Gerald said. "Server room." Ji-hoon looked at Min Jae. "Harrison's phone went dark 8 minutes ago," Min Jae said. He had been tracking it, and she hadn't known. Clara. Zuri moved toward the elevator. Ji-hoon caught her arm not roughly, but with the definitive weight of someone intercepting it became a decision before it became an action. "Stairs," he said. "Elevator announces you." They took the stairs. 4 members of Ji-hoon's security team came through the freight entrance behind them, moving fast and quiet in the way that people move when they have trained for exactly this kind of building, this kind of hour, this kind of necessary urgency. Zuri climbed and counted floors by the numbers stenciled on each landing door and tried to manage her breathing, which wanted to run ahead of her, and mostly succeeded. The 9th floor stairwell door opened onto a corridor that was dim the overhead fluorescence on their night setting, half power, casting everything in a flat, institutional light that made distances look slightly wrong. 2 of Ji-hoon's team went first, then Min Jae, then Ji-hoon with Zuri at his shoulder. Corridor was empty. The compliance division server room door was closed. The lockdown indicator light above the door frame was dark. The lockdown had been disengaged. Someone had used a physical override, Pace's keycard, the one that had last registered in Midtown, which meant Pace was either here himself or had transferred the card to someone else, and both possibilities were bad in different ways. Min Jae positioned himself to the left of the door. 2 security team members took the right. Ji-hoon stood back with Zuri, and she registered in some non-verbal, physical way that this positioning was intentional, that he had placed her behind him without making a production of it, without announcing it. Simply arranged the geometry of the corridor so that she was not the first thing anyone coming through that door would encounter. She noticed it. She didn't move from where he'd positioned her. Min Jae opened the door. The server room was occupied by 3 people. Harrison, seated on the floor with his back against the equipment rack and his hands behind him, restrained. Clara, standing at the main terminal, typing, with a man behind her whose hand was on her shoulder, in the particular way that hands are placed on shoulders when the sub-threat rather than comfort, and Richard Pace, standing at the center of the room, looking at the door with the expression of a man who had prepared for multiple scenarios and was now determining which one he was in. Pace was 61 years old, and Zuri had worked in proximity to him for 5 years, without ever registering him as anything other than a competent administrative presence, the kind of person who exists in large organizations as institutional furniture, necessary and invisible. She registered him now as something entirely different. The same face, the same tailored jacket, the same careful posture. But the eyes were doing different work than they had done in the meeting room that afternoon, and the difference was the difference between a mask and the thing underneath it. "Ms. Bennett," Pace said. "Mr. Kang." He said it the way you say things when you've given up on one version of the outcome and are calculating the next. "I had hoped this conversation could wait until morning." "Step away from her," Ji-hoon said. He meant the man behind Clara. Marcus, Pace said. "Just the name." The man behind Clara didn't move. "The archive is already transmitted," Zuri said. "Clara already sent everything. Whatever you think you're interrupting, you're about 4 hours late." Pace looked at Clara. Clara kept typing without turning around, which was either courage or a very specific kind of strategic focus, and Zuri suspected it was both. "I know the archive was transmitted," Pace said. I'm not here about the archive. Then what? Ji-hoon said. I'm here because Sloan told me to be here, Pace said. And I'm here because after 22 years of doing what I was told in this organization, I am finished being the person who handles the things that can't be acknowledged and receives nothing in return. His voice was even. He had rehearsed this, or something like it. And the rehearsal gave it the quality of a document being read, rather than a conversation being had. The injunction will be reinstated. The archive will be challenged as a fabricated instrument produced under duress. Derek Halston's testimony will be withdrawn. His cooperation agreement is contingent on conditions we've already begun the process of contesting. You have nothing that holds. We have you, Zuri said. In this room. On camera. Pace looked at the ceiling. At the server room's security camera above the door. The camera feed from this room has been rerouted since 2/9 a.m., he said. It's currently feeding a loop from Tuesday afternoon. Min Jai's jaw tightened. 1 millimeter. Then we have witnesses, Zuri said. You have employees, Pace said, and I have a regulatory filing that establishes each of them as participants in a conspiracy to fabricate evidence against a legitimate compliance investigation. He looked at her directly. You, specifically Ms. Bennett, are named in that filing as the primary architect of the fabrication. Your access to the Compliance Division's server room, your use of my credentials to initiate the lockdown, your coordination with an individual, Clara Shin, who was terminated from this organization's Active Operations Division 14 months ago for a security protocol violation. He paused. Every action you have taken tonight has been documented by my people and will be submitted as evidence of your coordination of an ongoing fraud. The room was very quiet. Zuri stood in the quiet and looked at Richard Pace and thought about what he had just described, which was a mirror image: her actions, her access, her coordination with Clara, her use of his compliance code, all of it reframed as perpetration rather than response. The same facts, different narrative. It was elegant in the same way that the pharmaceutical vessel authorization had been elegant, constructed from real components, arranged to produce a false conclusion. She thought about the 37-second window, about gaps in the architecture that only exist if you know where to look. Clara's termination, she said. Pace looked at her. You said she was terminated from the operations division for a security protocol violation, Zuri said. 14 months ago. Correct. What was the violation? Pace's expression adjusted slightly. Not much. The adjustment of a man who is holding a document and has just noticed a question about a footnote. An unauthorized access attempt on restricted architecture files, he said. Your architecture files, Zuri said. The Compliance Division's architecture files, Pace said, which fall under my authority, and you initiated the termination. I authorized it, yes. So you terminated the woman who was investigating you, Zuri said, 14 months ago, and then documented that termination as a security violation, which you then used tonight to frame her participation in this investigation as illegitimate. The room received this. Clara had stopped typing. She was still facing the terminal, but her shoulders had changed, the particular change of someone who has been carrying weight alone for a long time and has just felt someone take the other end of it. The termination is documented, Pace said, but his voice had shifted. A fraction. The reading from a document quality had developed a seam. So is the timing, Zuri said. The termination occurred 3 weeks after. Clara first accessed your compliance architecture files in the course of her investigation. The sequence is in the access log, the same log that Clara used to build the archive. The same archive that documents 4 years of communication between you and Victor Sloan. She looked at him steadily. You didn't terminate her for a security violation. You terminated her to stop the investigation, and then you documented the termination in language that made it look like the violation. Pace said nothing. The man behind Clara, Ji-hoon, said, Quiet. The particular quiet that had weight. Move away from her. The man called Marcus looked at Pace. Pace looked at Ji-hoon. He looked at Minjai, positioned to his left. He looked at the 4 security team members in the corridor visible through the open door. He looked at Harrison on the floor, who was watching him with the patient, calibrated attention of a man waiting for a situation to complete itself. And then he looked at Zuri. Whatever calculation he ran in those 3 seconds produced a result that cost him something to acknowledge. She could see it arrive in his face, not defeat, exactly, but the specific exhaustion of a man who has maintained a position for a very long time and has just run out of the energy required to maintain it any further. "Marcus," he said, "stand down." Marcus stepped back from Clara. Clara turned from the terminal for the first time. She looked at Zuri across the server room. Her face was tired in the specific way that faces are tired when they have been doing something difficult and necessary for a very long time, in a very small space. And the small space has finally opened. "The secondary archive," Clara said. "I found it at 1:09 a.m. and transmitted it alongside the primary. It contains the termination correspondence. His messages to Sloan discussing my investigation 6 weeks before I was removed." She looked at Pace. "I wanted you to know it's in there." Pace sat down on the floor. Not dramatically. He simply lowered himself to the floor and put his arms on his knees and looked at the middle distance. And the gesture was so human and so deflated and so entirely devoid of the regulatory authority he had wrapped around himself for 22 years that it briefly produced something in Zuri that she identified as pity before she set it aside. Minjai made 2 calls. Harrison's restraints came off. The rerouted camera feed was restored and documented as evidence of tampering. Marcus and the 2 individuals who had been in the corridor were secured and removed from the building by Ji-hoon's people with the efficiency of a process that had been run before and did not require improvisation. At 3:14 a.m., Richard Pace was formally detained, his detention documented, photographed, and transmitted to 3 separate legal contacts, including the independent attorney Zuri had texted from Derek's room. At 3:31 a.m., Victor Sloan, who had been monitoring the building from a location Minjai's trace had narrowed to a 2-block radius on the west side of Lower Manhattan, received a secure transmission that contained the primary and secondary archive files. Derek's recorded testimony, the surveillance truck's geolocated photographs, and a single line of text from Ji-hoon. "You have the wrong organization." Sloan did not respond. At 4:07 a.m., federal financial crimes agents, who had been in contact with Ji-hoon's legal teams since 1:47 a.m. and had spent the intervening hours authenticating the archive materials, initiated a coordinated action at 3 locations simultaneously. The Hoboken server cluster, a residential address in Connecticut, registered to a shell entity connected to Sloan's consulting network, and a hotel in Midtown where Sloan had checked in under a corporate account at 11:50 p.m. Sloan was in the hotel when they arrived. Zuri learned this at 4:23 a.m., sitting in a chair in the Black Harbor operations room, with her wet shoe removed and her bare foot on the concrete floor, drinking coffee that was hot and extremely bad and exactly what she needed. Dana gave her the report. Clara was 3 workstations down, running a final check on the archive transmission integrity. Harrison was in the stairwell, making a phone call she couldn't hear. Minjai came in at 4:41 a.m. and said 2 words, "He's in custody." The room absorbed this without celebration. That was the thing about people who worked in a room like Black Harbor. They had trained themselves out of the visible displays that victory produces in people who encounter it rarely. They adjusted. They moved to the next thing. Ji-hoon was at the far end of the room, at the monitors he retreated to, and the situation required thinking rather than action. He was standing the way he always stood, still, precise, looking at something that wasn't the screen in front of him. Zuri got up. She put her wet shoe back on because the alternative was walking barefoot across a concrete floor in a covert operations center at 4:41 in the morning, and she had made enough unusual choices tonight without adding that one. She walked to where he was standing. He didn't turn around. "Clara's investigation," she said. "You knew about it." "Not the specifics," he said. "I knew she had concerns. I didn't know she had taken them to Sloan's network as a methodology. Would you have stopped her if you had?" He was quiet for a moment. "I don't know," he said, which was the most honest thing she had heard anyone say in a long time. Pace was in your organization for 22 years, she said. Yes, and you didn't see it. No. She stood beside him and looked at the digital wall. The ships were where they always were, moving through the dark water of shipping lanes that didn't care what happened on shore, indifferent and continuous and enormous. The 17 people in Clara's files, she said. The ones Pace flagged. I'll know their names by morning, Ji-hoon said. I knew some of them. I thought I knew how they died. She didn't push that. It wasn't her territory, and he wasn't ready, and the knight had already asked enough of both of them. The succession protocol, she said. He turned to look at her then. Finally. His face in the monitor light was tired in the way that faces are tired when the tiredness coming from somewhere deeper than the current night. You could have told me, she said. 4 years ago. Or 3. Or 1. Yes, he said. Why didn't you? Because the moment I told you, he said, you would have started performing the role instead of just being who you were. And who you were was exactly what I needed. He paused. I was wrong. Not to tell you. That was a decision made in the interest of the organization at the expense of your right to know something that concerned you directly. I don't have a better defense than that. She looked at the ships. I used Pace's compliance code, she said. I warned him. That's how they got into the building tonight. Yes. If you hadn't, he said, Clara wouldn't have been locked in the server room long enough to complete the secondary archive. Pace's people would have reached the terminal before she finished. We would have had the primary archive and not the termination correspondence, which means the filing challenge would have taken weeks rather than hours, and Sloan would have had time to restructure. Looked at her. The mistake was necessary, not because you designed it that way. Because you made the best decision available to you with the information you had, and the consequence of that decision closed a gap that none of us saw coming. Turn that over. It wasn't comfort, exactly. It was something more precise than comfort, an accurate accounting of cause and effect that happened to be less terrible than she had been carrying it. Gerald, she said, his head. He's been seen by our medical person, Ji-hoon said. He'll be fine. He's currently eating a granola bar in the lobby and refusing to go home until his shift ends at 7. She almost laughed again. The same feeling as before, warmth rising, held except this time she let a small fraction of it out, just the edge of it, a sound that was halfway between exhale and amusement. Ji-hoon watched her make that sound. She looked at him looking at her, and there was a moment that had texture and weight, and she named it to herself, accurately and without embellishment, and then she let it exist, without doing anything with it. Because the night had been long and she was wet and tired, and some things deserve more room than the end of a crisis provides. I want to sleep, she said. Yes, he said. And then I want to talk about the protocol, she said. Properly, with a table and documentation and time. I want to understand what I'm agreeing to, all of it, before I agree to anything else. Yes, he said. That's the right way to do it. And I want Clara in that conversation, she said. Whatever she did and why she did it, she spent 14 months inside an enemy network to protect something she believed was worth protecting. She's earned a seat at that table. Ji-hoon looked at her for a long moment. Agreed, he said. She left Black Harbor at 5:08 a.m. Min-jae had a car waiting, not a security convoy, just a car, which she understood as a form of statement, a small normalization of something that had been anything but normal for 96 hours. She sat in the back seat and watched the city outside the window do its early morning thing. The delivery trucks, the joggers who existed in another world entirely, the street cleaners working the pre-dawn quiet, the slow return of a place to its ordinary self after a night it hadn't experienced. She slept for 6 hours. Real sleep, the kind without negotiation, without the partial wakefulness of a person's waiting for the next crisis. She woke to a city in full daylight and a phone with 17 notifications until she had showered and eaten something and sat at her kitchen table for 20 minutes in the particular silence of a woman who is deciding, for the first time in a long time, what she actually wants the next part of her life to look like. The emergency shareholders assembly was held 3 weeks later in the 47th floor boardroom. The same marble floor, the same floor-to-ceiling glass. Splitting. A different configuration of people, some of the same faces. But the ones who had sat in silence during Stetson performance were distributed differently now, as though the room had been shuffled and redealt. Ji-hoon presented for 40 minutes, financial records, wire transfer documentation, the archive communications, Derek's testimony, now formally certified and included in 2 federal filings, the indictment of Richard Pace on 4 counts, including conspiracy and obstruction, the filing of charges against Victor Sloan across 3 jurisdictions, the coordinated seizure of 6 shell entities through financial crimes authorities. He presented it with the precision of a man who has had long practice at making complex things legible to audiences who would prefer not to have to understand them. Then, he did something that produced a quality of silence in the room that was different from the silence she had experienced on that floor 3 weeks earlier. He said that the survival of Haedong Meridian in the past 96 hours was not his achievement. He stepped back from the podium. He said Zuri Bennett's name. She walked to the front of the room in a suit she had bought 2 days earlier, deep navy, structured at the shoulders, cut for the body she had, not for the body that made other people comfortable. Her full figure, visible and present, and not apologized for by the way she held herself or the way she occupied space. She looked at the room. Some of the same people who had looked at the floor while Derek spoke were looking at her now. She identified each of them calmly, in her peripheral vision, not as enemies or allies, but simply as data people who made decisions based on what they calculated was valuable, and who were recalibrating in real time. She didn't need them to recalibrate. She had stopped needing it somewhere between the authentication log and the server room floor, though she couldn't have told you the exact moment. I spent a long time believing that the way to be recognized was to be indispensable, she said. To work longer hours, solve harder problems, protect people who didn't protect me, and wait for the room to eventually catch up to what I was doing. She looked at the marble floor for a moment. Not the spot where she had fallen, just the floor, the whole of it, ordinary and cold and expensive. I was wrong about that. Recognition is not something that can be compelled by excellence. Some rooms will always look at what you look like before they look at what you've done. The answer to that isn't to work harder. The answer is to stop waiting for the room and start building the table you actually deserve to sit at. She talked for 11 more minutes. She talked about the investigation. About Clara. About what a compliance infrastructure looks like when it's being operated honestly versus when it's been turned into a private surveillance network. She talked about the 17 people whose names she now knew and whose files sat in a secured folder that she had read in full the week before this assembly and whose families would be contacted personally rather than through intermediaries. She did not talk about Derek. He didn't require her to. He was present in the room as an absence, the shape of a story the room already knew the outline of, filling in its own details. After the assembly, 2 executives she had never spoken to individually came to her in the corridor and introduced themselves with the specific energy of people who are establishing a relationship for the first time and are aware that the timing is not ideal, but are doing it anyway because the alternative is not doing it. She spoke with them for approximately 3 minutes each. She was polite. She was not warm. Warmth, she had decided, splitting, was something she would distribute based on what people had actually done rather than what they were currently presenting, and 3 weeks was not long enough for a comprehensive assessment. She found Ji-hoon in the corridor outside the boardroom after the executives left. He was standing at the window that faced west, looking at the harbor, which was doing the thing it always did, moving. Continuous, indifferent, carrying the weight of commerce and distance with the particular blankness of water. She stood beside him. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The city went about itself below them. The corporate charter, she said. It's been formalized with the amendments we discussed, he said. Your legal team has reviewed it. My legal team, she said. She had retained the independent attorney, the one she had texted from Derek's room at 1:31 a.m., and had spent 2 full days going through the succession protocol and the corporate charter with someone who had no existing relationship with Haedong Meridian and whose loyalty to her was purchased rather than inherited. Your legal team, Ji-hoon confirmed. The operational oversight structure, she said. The provision requiring quarterly independent security audits that report to the board rather than to the compliance division. In the amended charter, and Clara's reinstatement. Formally completed yesterday, he said. Architecture division, senior level. I gave her the option of a different title if she preferred. What did she choose? The same one she had before, Ji-hoon said. She said the title wasn't the problem. Zuri looked at the harbor. At the ships. She had learned more about those ships in the past 3 weeks than she had absorbed in 5 years, their routes, their cargo classifications, the particular political geography of the ports they moved through, the relationships that made them reliable, and the vulnerabilities that made them targets. She had learned it by asking questions to people who initially looked surprised to be asked, and had then answered with the specificity of people who didn't often get to talk about what they actually did. She was going to keep asking questions, for a long time. That was the thing about inheriting something you didn't build. You learned it by walking through it with attention, not by performing mastery you hadn't earned yet. Derek, she said. Federal sentencing is in 6 weeks, Ji-hoon said. His cooperation agreement is finalized. The prosecutors have what they need. I know, she said. She had received that notification herself, through her attorney. I'm not asking about the case. Ji-hoon was quiet. I'm asking whether you think he actually understands what he did, she said. Not the legal consequences, what he actually did. Ji-hoon considered this with the seriousness it deserved rather than providing the reassuring answer. No, he said. I think he understands that he miscalculated. I don't think he'll ever fully understand the difference between those two things. She had suspected that was the answer. It didn't produce grief, or the desire for grief, or any of the things she had expected to feel about it 3 weeks ago when she had first asked herself the same question. What it produced was a kind of settled clarity, the clarity of a person who stopped waiting for the accounting to arrive from the person who owes it and has accepted that some debts are never paid in a form you can use. She reached into the bag she was carrying and placed a black folder on the windowsill. Ji-hoon looked at it. The original succession protocol, she said. I read it in full. I had my attorney review it. I've written annotations on 12 pages. Some of them are requests for amendment. Some of them are questions that require answers before those pages are binding. She looked at him. If we're doing this, we're doing it with all 12 pages addressed. Ji-hoon picked up the folder. He opened it. He looked at the first page of annotations, her handwriting in the margins. Precise and close, the handwriting of someone who does not waste the space available to them. Something moved across his face. Not surprise. Something more considered than surprise. The expression of a man who has been watching someone for a long time and has just witnessed them become, in a fully visible and irreversible way, the thing he thought they could be. All 12 pages, he said. All 12, she said. He extended his hand. She looked at it. His hand, the same one that had gathered merger documents from a marble floor when nobody else moved. The same one that had placed a coffee beside her terminal at 3:44 in the morning without being asked. The hand of a man who had made decisions about her future without consulting her, and who had also beside her on a floor when everyone else had looked away, and who was going to have to live with the contradiction of those two things, for as long as she chose to keep track of it. She took his hand. The handshake was firm and brief, and exactly what it was. 2 people standing at the same elevation, neither one of them arriving there without cost, neither one of them pretending otherwise. She let go. I'll schedule the first protocol review for next week, she said. Have your attorney and mine in the same room. Bring the 12 pages. Done, he said. She picked up her bag. She walked back down the corridor toward the elevator, past the boardroom entrance, past the spot on the floor she didn't look at anymore, past the window with the harbor view, past the ordinary geography of a building she had occupied for 5 years as one thing and was now entering as another. Gerald was at the security desk when she came through the lobby. He looked up from whatever he was reading. Ms. Bennett, he said. Gerald, she said. She stopped at the desk. She had brought something. She had thought about this on the way in, had stopped on the way to the building, and made a small purchase that she was now slightly self-conscious about, in the way that in small gestures, in large moments, can be self-conscious. She placed a box of granola bars on his desk, an entire box. Not a single bar from a drawer, but 12 of them in a cardboard package, practical and unremarkable, and the closest thing to a speech she was going to give him. Gerald looked at the box. He looked at her. "Thank you," he said. She had been going to say something. She had composed something in the elevator brief, accurate, acknowledging what he'd done and what it had cost him, and the dried blood above his left eyebrow that had faded now but wasn't gone. She didn't say it. She just nodded. Outside, the late afternoon had arrived with the particular quality of New York autumn, cold enough to mean it, bright enough to ignore the cold, the light hitting the harbor at an angle that made the water look almost bronze. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment without moving. Not performing it. Just standing there in the city that had seen everything and catalogued none of it. Breathing air that tasted like exhaust and water, and the end of something that had taken everything she had and returned her to herself in a form she was still getting used to. She thought about her mother, briefly about a phone call she had been putting off, and that needed to happen before the week was out, because the kind of mother she had deserved more than silence, and Zuri had been giving her silence for 3 weeks, out of a combination of exhaustion and the specific difficulty of explaining her life to someone who knew only one version of it. She thought about Clara at her desk in the architecture division, rebuilding something she had spent 14 months dismantling in order to preserve it. Thought Greenwood, the particular cost of that, the loneliness of it, the sustained discipline of being inside something you were trying to protect while performing the role of someone who had turned against it. She had scheduled a lunch with Clara for Thursday. Not a debrief. Lunch. She thought about Derek, in whatever apartment he was currently living in, under the terms of his cooperation agreement, and she thought about it for exactly as long as it took her to walk to the corner, which was not very long. She flagged a cab. The harbor was visible through the cab's east-facing window as it pulled into traffic, the water, and the ships and the last of the bronze light moving across, both of them in the way light moves when it's almost done with a particular day and is letting it go. The ships were Haedong Meridian ships. Some of them. Some of them were going to be hers. Not because she was saved. Not because a powerful man had chosen her. Not because she had survived the night in a server room, or held a phone on a wet street corner, or built an authentication window that nobody had thought to ask her about. Because she had shown up before everyone else, and stayed after everyone left, and done the work that didn't get acknowledged, and protected the people beneath her, and made the choices that were right over the choices that were easy. And because, in a marble boardroom, on her knee on a cold floor, surrounded by papers she had worked through until 3:21 in the morning, she had not collapsed into the shape someone else had decided she should occupy. Because of all of that, because of who she was when nobody was watching. The cab moved through the city. The water disappeared behind buildings. The light continued its slow departure. Zuri looked out the window and let the city pass.